Alrighty then. I think we can start on this November 18th, 2019. Time is 9:10. This is a work session on the Land Development Code revision. We're going to start off with staff making a presentation to us. The hope is that the presentation, we're going to let them run through the presentation without any questions from up here. Our hope is that at the back end of the presentation, which should be roughly 45 minutes, then we'll have like 15 minutes or so. We'll go around and let people ask questions. Everybody could have a couple minutes in that period. And then the way that we've talked about doing this is we have identified like 6 areas that cover like the universe. But I have no idea if the council members want to actually talk about each of those areas or things within those areas. But so that we end the day with everybody having had the ability to speak to each of the different areas, I'm going to call the areas like that. I'm going to use what the Mayor Pro Tem did as best we can because it seemed to work well. So we'll go through each one of those 6 areas. Everybody should know they have about 12 minutes to speak, because if everybody speaks for 12 minutes, we exhaust the next little over 2 hours. Don't feel compelled to use your 2 minutes in any one of the 6 areas. You could use all 12 of your minutes in one area on one topic if that's what you want to do. But I'm going to try and keep track of running time for everybody so that we can do that. We'll go through the 6 areas. At the end of going through the 6 areas, if we have a lot of time left, we'll just open it up and let people talk about topic areas. But when there's a half an hour left to go, we're going to stop wherever we are and we're going to talk about process for first reading so that people can talk about that. So that's how we're going to proceed. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor and Council.
I'm sorry.
I missed. When's the end? There's a time certain end time?
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock. Thank you.
So basically, the first hour is going to be this. If everybody has 12 minutes and there are 11 of us, that's a little over 2 hours. That's 3 hours. If the last half an hour is processed, that gives us 30 minutes of kind of flex time. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor and Council. Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager. With us today, of course, are Nick Baudet and Brent Roy, the leadership team members for the Land Development Code revision, as well as numerous other staff members. As you may recall, the Planning Commission adopted or approved the Land Development Code revision last week. And we are here today to talk to you about their recommendation and provide you an overview of that, as well as to go over some planned refinements to the residential zones and to mapping, and not just talk about it in a text manner, but to provide you some illustrations as well as to what those mean. And then, of course, to preview the November 25th planned second supplemental report. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Baudet.
Thanks, Rodney. Good morning. Let's see. Here's our timeline. We always like to start with our timeline that is looking more and more robust every time we come to work session, filling in where we've been in the community, talking about the code, and most importantly, receiving input. The purpose today for showing this slide is to communicate that we've really moved from the October 4th draft in refinements, and that's going to be what you're going to see today is refinements throughout the code based on hundreds of hours, literally, of office hours with the community, one-on-ones with your offices, town halls, with you and your constituents over the month of October, our own city staff hosted open houses. And during the month of October, we also did our public testing, and have learned a lot about refinements needed to assure the code meets our community values and goals that we've set out. So today, we are going to go over those refinements. This is just a quick process update. We released October 25th supplemental staff report. And then, as Rodney pointed out, November 12th, Planning Commission, after 8 meetings of deliberation, special called meetings, they were able to complete their recommendation to Mayor and Council. And we will be going over in the presentation today highlights of their recommendation, and a final report of their recommendation on where staff agrees, disagrees, partially agrees, or is neutral to their recommendations will be out later this week for you all and the manager. Then we'll move into our supplemental staff report to be out November 25th, and then into council public hearing December 5th, and first ordinance reading on December 9th. So today, as I mentioned, we're here today with our consultant Peter Park, as well as members of the core team, to talk about specific refinements to residential zones, refinements to mapping, both in transition areas and high opportunity areas in service to council direction, and a preview of what will be further solidified in our second supplemental staff report to be out on the 25th. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brent to talk about some high-level areas that the Planning Commission went over and approved in their November 12th final recommendation, and then some more specifics related to non-residential and residential recommendations, and then we'll go into how those might look when on the ground. Brent?
Thanks, Brent Lloyd, and we're going to talk just briefly about, kind of give you an overview of the Planning Commission's recommendation in their report, which we will be providing to you by the end of the week. As Anik mentioned, the Commission conducted multiple deliberations, including on Veterans Day, which to my knowledge is unprecedented for a city meeting. And is a sign of their commitment to the process. And their final action was taken on November 12th. And we are briefly just going to provide some highlights. This is by no means an exhaustive elucidation of all their recommendations, but some of the ones that we think are critical and worth mentioning. By way of their non-residential recommendations to the broader parts of the code, they recommended generally increasing transition area depth and intensity on corridors to better leverage the 2016 mobility bond program. And this is definitely a theme that runs throughout the transportation chapter as well, is better utilizing contributions, utilizing the land development code in a way that better aligns with the city's transportation priorities and pools different resources to leverage the construction of improvements. Another recommendation is to count above ground parking against floor to area ratio in all residential zones that have bonus with unlimited FAR. To tailor utilities review and requirements for missing middle housing. We expect as well, as we signaled in the October 25th supplemental report, that programmatically we will be recommending improvements and refinements to the utilities process to better, going forward, to better produce housing capacity. And this recommendation relates to that. Another recommendation is to further clarify and streamline site plan requirements for missing middle housing. And we look forward to talking further with council about the site plan process, and the process working group of the commission had a number of valuable recommendations with respect to the site plan process. And finally, one that's specific to downtown is whenever CC is zoned downtown, allow unlimited height and FAR through the downtown density bonus program. And again, this is just an overview of some of the highlights, and there are lots more that we look forward to presenting in our report. And then before we turn it over to Peter and Laura, we'll just summarize at a high level some of the recommendations with respect to the residential regulations. One of the themes that I think runs throughout a lot of their recommendations is to reduce the scale and intensity of lower unit yield residential projects. And the first recommendation that we'll mention in that regard is to reduce single unit impervious cover. And that was also a recommendation in our October 25th supplemental report. And I think we'll be expanding on that in light of the Commission's recommendation. Additionally, to graduate impervious cover for more than one unit. And again, this relates to the theme of really having enhanced entitlements serve the purpose of housing capacity in multi-units, and looking at ways that the scale and intensity of projects can be reduced for lower unit projects. Similarly, graduated floor to area ratio by unit count, exempt accessory dwelling units from the FAR calculation, cap preservation bonus for floor to area ratio, and re-implementation of the garage exemption, which I think Peter and Laura will touch on as well. And then finally, double height spaces would count twice towards floor to area ratio under the Commission's recommendation. So with that, we'll dovetail into a presentation with lots of good graphics by our consultant Peter Park and Laura Keating.
Thank you, Brent. May I please have the remote? Thanks. So what we'd like to do is give you kind of an overview of some of the things that staff has been looking at, as Anik mentioned, through a lot of sources of input and testing. The staff has been looking beyond the October 4th draft and making refinements and studying further refinements to the code. In this diagram, you can see, per council direction, from the corridor. So when you see, if you read from right to left here, the red Main Street or mixed-use zones, or sometimes multi-unit zones along a corridor, and then counting that 5 lots in with a transition of RM1, multi-unit, and an R4, transitioning then to the neighborhood R2 scale, the house scale residential zones. And we use this diagram just to reemphasize that these bands of transition areas are comprised of the R4 and the RM1. The RM1 is the most intensive, and the intention per council direction was to provide a smooth transition from the scale of the corridor to the residential scale. And so, for example, in an RM1, typically mapped of the transition areas, mapped the least actually, if there's a case where there is an existing single-family house or a small apartment building, the scale of new construction could be more, would be more per council direction of upzoning, particularly in the RM1, and providing that transition from the tall scale of the corridor. So we just want to emphasize that that only happens, it doesn't happen everywhere where you have this juxtaposition. It really is in the situations where you have the RM1. And then the R4 really is at that house scale, which makes a smooth transition to the R2. So we're going to go through some of the refinements that staff is considering right now. And just as a starting point for context, in this drawing you can see, starting from the reading left to right now, if one would imagine an existing fourplex in an area, that might be maybe today actually MF3 right behind the corridor. And then under the October 4th draft, you see a model of a 3-unit that is potential, and you see a model of a 5-unit in RM1 under the October 4th draft. And then next to the 5-unit building, you see what might be an existing 1-story house from the 1950s or something. So again, we would find in these contexts a variety of building scales, but per the council direction, this is right behind the corridor or more intensive scale, and so that's why there are additional heights. Now, another thing that we'd like to show you is the way that we study these is we study them with the intention of understanding what is possible and what is likely under the code. We don't really study it from the sort of theoretical worst case, but really from the what's likely to happen. And as we study them, we really look at them from the way that we all experience buildings and experience space. And so when we take these views, we study them at the eye level as if one were walking along the street. And we just selected a few views here. But this is exactly how we studied the relationship of form and how new structures will relate to each other and study how they would relate to existing situations. So under the October 4th, particularly in the RM1, the FAR for units, 3 units or more, moves up to 0.8. And as we've studied this, in this situation, how big is this lot? 7,200? So if this site was about 7,200 square feet, the lot is 7,200 square feet, if one did 3 units at a 0.8 FAR, you get an average of about 1,900 square feet. In the October 4th draft, the height limit was 4 stories, and theoretically you could get 4 floors. It would be kind of low, but you could potentially get 4 floors. And so if one were to do a building with a lot of balcony and outdoor space, theoretically you could get up to that 4 stories. As we study this further, and again, with the intention of focusing on adding capacity and encouraging more units, not necessarily out-of-scale units, but additional units, staff is studying possibility of managing that to a 0.6. So if one did a 3-unit building on this site, it would be 1,400 square feet, right? And we've also are thinking about some other things. For example, if one did a duplex in the RM1, or keeping that at the lower FAR, but if the site is smaller, and again, this is what we're still studying, if the site is smaller to the minimum of 5,000 square feet, right, maybe, it's the FAR is 0.6 or 1,500 square feet, whichever is more. So just as a way of making more likely the possibility of units when the site is on the smaller range of a lot, right? Okay. So, I'm sorry. And then also, we're looking at reducing the height if you were doing a 3-unit. Because this is RM1 after all, and the intent is really to get more units than 3 units, right? 3 large units. The intent is to really get, if the base is 6 and the bonus is 10, is to really try to figure out how to create the capacity on the lot right behind the corridor fronting lots. Now we're moving to the R4, some of the things that staff is reviewing in terms of refinements under the R4. So in this context, what you see is the potential of 3 units, reading left to right again, under the R4 in the October 4th draft. We're also showing a new duplex that is possible under the current code. And I think this is actually from an approved project that is built or under construction. What you could do in 4 units under the R4 from the October 4th draft. And again, the comparison to if you had an existing 1-story house currently in an R4 zone, right? So if we go down to the street level, what you see in the October 4th draft is the attic floor area under October 4th draft does not count FAR. And so in this case, if one were to create a gambrel roof or some other roof form that maximizes the attic, you can get a fair amount more square footage that does not count toward FAR. On the right, in the blue outline, we've simply drawn what the current McMansion tent looks like under the current code. And you can see a house that could be built in the scale of it under the current McMansion tent. So one of the refinements that staff is looking at is similar to today, including in the FAR the attic floor area with a partial exemption. Right? We still have to calculate that. One of the intentions of not including the attic floor area in draft 4 was really 2 things. One is under the current code, It's pretty complicated to figure out how to count the floor area in those attics. And so we're going to work on figuring out a simpler way to describe that. The second part of it was thinking about one's ability to use an existing attic in an older home, possibly for an ADU or for expansion space. And so the intention was to really allow homeowners to use that existing space under roof without it counting to FAR. So one further refinement of this thinking might be in the case of remodeling or utilizing one's attic for an ADU or an expansion, then it does not count. But otherwise, on a new build, it would count, right? So that's something that we're considering. And again, you can see the McMansion tent under the current code in relation to 1950s ranch house that might look there. So you can, again, we are always looking at this in terms of how does the proposed code or the refinements that we're studying relate to what one can do under the current entitlements, under the current zone. Not necessarily always exactly as the world stands today, but what one could do with a property today. Moving on to the R2. Here we're looking at calibrating the FAR by unit again. Again, reading left to right, you see a house plus an ADU. That's possible under the current code. I think this is actually another project that's actually built, right? So this is approvable under the current code. An existing one-story house. And then a duplex, as could be developed under the October 4th draft in an R2 zone. But also for comparison's sake, the massing of a house, a single-family house, theoretically, with a lot of roofscape, theoretically a single-family house that could be built under the current code, under current McMansion rules, and then again, for point of reference, an existing one-story house. So when we go to the street level and see how these work, under the October 4th draft, what it allowed for the duplex is it moved the FAR from 0.4 today if one had 7,000 square feet to 0.6 if it just set it at 0.6 for duplex. So in this case, for a site of this size, that would work out to about 2,100 square feet per unit under the proposed code. And just for reference, so you know, if you look here, you see the two sort of wire frames. Those are those represent the current McMansion tent. And the single-family house that's possible under the current McMansion tent. The building that's between those two tents is the duplex at a 0.6 FAR, which again for this site ends up being about 2,100 square feet. As we've looked at it, based on testing and things that we've studied, we're looking at adjusting the FAR down to 0.4 for a duplex. So on this size of a site, it ends up being 1,500 square feet. And again, as I mentioned before, one of the ways to deal with this is setting it at 0.4 as today. But if the lot is smaller, in the 5,000 to 6,999 square foot range, the language might read 0.4 or 1,500 square feet, whichever is larger. So in this case, so for example, at a 0.4 FAR for a 5,000 square foot lot, that would allow, in a duplex condition, 1,000 square feet per unit. So that, in terms of input that we've heard from folks who develop duplexes and develop these units, that's on the small range. And so if the emphasis is on creating family-friendly housing, to create So we're trying to strike that balance between what is likely, and so feedback that we've gotten is if it's too tight for the size of a duplex, it won't get developed. And so what we're really trying to figure out is where is it attractive enough to get the duplex rather than just do the single family with the ADU or just the larger single family as it is, right? So this is, again, looking at calibrating the FAR by unit, but also looking at it from the size of the site at the smaller end of the lot sizes. Okay? As Brent mentioned, our two refinements illustrated is under the October 4th draft, as I mentioned earlier, the attic does not count toward FAR, and so we're looking at putting back with some partial exemption. Also putting back double height spaces or ceiling heights over 15 feet to count double toward FIR, as today, very similar today. And also adding back, including the garage floor area in FER with a partial exemption. Okay. And then finally, the preservation incentive in the R2 refinement. Again, here the idea is calibrate the FIR by unit under the preservation incentive. Under the October 4th draft, if one preserved, on the left side you see a existing small house, older house, that gets preserved and a duplex gets developed in the back with a roof deck on the third floor. On the right, you see the potential of doing two accessory dwelling units, essentially, behind the preservation of an existing house. So as we studied this further, we are looking at something similar to the other refinement under the October 4th, it was a 0.6 FAR for duplex. In this case, would result in 2,100 square foot unit again, 2,100 square feet per unit again. And you can sort of make it out. If you look through the McMansion tent there, you can just see the top of that duplex from where we're standing. And the study that staff is looking at is dialing that again back down to 0.4, in which case that building, again, unless one were to basically build a building that was all outdoor space and very little interior space, but in this case would be less visible from the street and would result in potential of 1,500 square feet per unit if developed as a duplex in the preservation situation. So this is just kind of a summary of the sort of things that staff continues to look at, and we wanted to share with you how we study these situations with these type of drawings, with a focus on how does one actually experience these, especially from the street, from the public realm. And there are some components of the existing code that you probably recognize. We're thinking of putting back in. But again, the goal would be to make it easier to use than it is today to figure out these situations, and also being very mindful of the differences in that the square footage of the lot make relative to the FAR, and that we might provide for some adjustment when it is in that smaller lot situation. Okay, and now I'll hand it back over to Anique.
Thanks, Peter. So the next portion of the presentation is really 3 slides. The first, just 2 points on our revised staff recommendation on transition areas. To be more clear, on October 25th, we signaled our intent to reduce transition areas in 2 ways. And one is when the corridors are primarily residential in nature and in context, that we would be reducing them, and specifically the method would be counting the corridor lot that's adjacent to the right-of-way, to the street, in in the count of the transition area, which would have the effect of reducing the transition areas on those primarily residential corridors by 1 lot. And then also to continue to reduce the transition areas in areas of the city that are susceptible to displacement as part of gentrification per the UT Uprooted study, particularly in areas that are susceptible in early stage and in a dynamic stage of gentrification. So being more precise on how we're handling both the residential corridors and the areas that are in susceptible early and dynamic stages of gentrification by further reducing the intensity and the area that is where we apply the transition zones. And this is consistent with the Planning Commission recommendations that they had as well on in these areas. And you'll see the slight differences when the report comes out later this week. So as we looked at reducing and being more context sensitive to affordability and displacement, we also looked in service to the council direction at how we can still stay within the 397,000 housing capacity number that our report card is saying we are hitting at this point by looking at opportunities in high opportunity areas of the city, specifically learning from testing, which we learned that corner lots in high opportunity areas, an application of the R3 zone, which hasn't been applied as robustly as the R2 zone, could be an opportunity to make up for that capacity. The Planning Commission also asked us to look at mapping R4, for example, adjacent to parks throughout opportunity areas. And then in our internal department comments and working with other staff throughout the city, grocery stores were another area where we're looking at how we might apply an R3 or an R4 subtly and gently throughout the city to keep the capacity at the 397,000 as we're looking at being careful in the gentrifying areas. We're also looking at centers. That was a Planning Commission recommendation that you'll see, and assuring that we are maximizing the entitlements in the centers and perhaps around the periphery of the center, which is proven to be a little trickier than it sounds. Many of our centers have major either TxDOT roadways or major roadways that intersect, and the edges are pretty much the highway boundary. So it's hard to look at the edges of that for that step down because they're not contiguous with the center. But we do think there is some room to add some more capacity through the concept of the centers, as well as the Planning Commission, which we agree with, wanted us to look at not only bus routes, but high-capacity transit with regards to the existing red line and the planned green line with regards to where the stops might be. So we'll be coordinating with Capital Metro in that respect. So that is how we're balancing out a more fine-tuning throughout the city with the capacity. And then in the supplemental staff report, we'll have more detailed recommendations consistent with today's presentation that Peter went through, and we look forward to your questions about that and input about that today. We're going to additionally show recommendations based on community feedback in our internal department staff review, which we're just combing through those recommendations as well. And then some significant background and framework on how all the existing regulating plans and neighborhood plans work together, and how our approach to the current recommendation for keeping F25 on some of those properties has been a lot of feedback. We've been asked of what was the criteria for Title 20 for former 25 per the council direction to really limit it and use our new tools in the code as much as possible. And so we'll have a robust explanation of that for you all and the public. So again, next steps, the 25th is the supplemental, moving into the public hearing, City Hall 10 a.m. on December 7th, and first ordinance reading 10 a.m. City Hall on December 9th. And with that, we'll open it up to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for the presentation. Questions or comments on this? Jimmy, you want to go first?
Just a quick one related to the transit stops. I think that's going to be a challenge because the transit stops farther along the line are all surrounded by PUD zonings or existing regulating plans. Not the one in mine, not the ones in Councilmember Poole's district have any flexibility surrounding those transit stops. The ones that do have flexibility are in the uprooted areas. So I think you might find some conflict on that. I just wanted to make that note. I would love to see some of the land around the Lakeline Station redeveloped, but it's really locked up in just what a private landowner is willing to do at the moment.
Anyone else want to make a comment on this? I think the maps are really good. And I like that you put on the map the range. You put in what is existing with a 1950 one-story bungalow. You put what was allowed in current code and what would be allowed under existing code. And I think everybody then can make their own comparisons on what it is that they want to use by comparison. I would just say that for me, the relevant comparison in that is if I own a home and the lot next to me gets sold to somebody else, I want to know what somebody's going to be able to build next to me. So the relevant comparison for me will be, in today's world, if we don't change the code, how big is somebody going to build next to me? And then under the new code, how big is somebody going to build next to me? And I'll make the same assumption that that person who's buying it is going to max out whatever it is that they can do in terms of my analysis. So that's what I'll be looking at. How are you going to get these maps out to the public for them to see?
We will post the presentation on our project website, and we may we'll make them available at the various meetings that we're continuing to go to with the public throughout this week and throughout November, but mainly through our web presence. Should be posted actually this morning already.
Okay. Would you, just by way of emphasis, will you send a link to that map site to each of the council offices?
Yes.
Just to make it super easy for us to be able to send out. Leslie.
Thanks for the updates. I'm looking at, I'll pick one of the pages, page 19, and I was curious on the setbacks from the property lines and the easements. Are we implying there that the setback from the curb is, 3 foot wide sidewalk, so edge to the curb, that'd be 6 feet, and then maybe I'm trying to figure out how deep is that lot and the proportions, the dimensions of the lot. It would be helpful to know how deep is that lot and how wide, and then how close to the curb are the fronts of the homes. Because I know that in our previous conversations we've talked about pushing the structures closer to the road. So if you are going to send this out, I might ask that you would give us a sense of how that fits on the lot and the setbacks on all 4 sides.
We can relabel that.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. I know that some of this is being done because we were looking at Chris and Gina Allen's renderings, and this is an attempt to show y'all's interpretation of the proposed rewrite. So that being the case, I would also ask that you take the same kind of perspective that they have so that we can also aim it to look at apples and apples. The bird's eye view is a little difficult to interpret. So the street side closer rendering, like you have on page 15, for example, is helpful, but it's also kind of skewed. If we could do a version of this rendering that looks straight on at the homes, so that it lines up a little bit more with what the Allens have proposed. Because this is going to be used as a way to compare with what Chris and Gina have done, as a way to say, well, they're wrong and we're right, or we're right and they're wrong, or vice versa. And in order to reduce the amount of conflict between there, it would be great if we could more directly model to show how staff thinks that those renderings are different from what you
So-
all are coming up with.
So these are
Does that make
renderings.
sense?
Well, just to reinforce that the way these drawings and the views that are taken, the way these are taken is the way a person that's about 5'6" would see and actually experience what buildings look like along the street. We didn't show what it's like as if I was, flying up at the second story looking at the buildings, but rather the way that one actually experiences it. So this is at an eye level. The horizon line is at the eye level of the way one views it.
That makes sense. So what is the distance away from the home? So that would be a way for us to compare the volume. The bird's eye one, of course, is like what's on page 11. Or the drone, actually.
Yeah. So the bird's eye views we provide just to
Right.
explain contextually so we can
Exactly.
show what's going on.
Yeah.
And again, that's taken at, I don't know, we're about 60 feet above or more looking down. Very few of us have the experience to see buildings in neighborhoods that way,
Right.
unless we had drones flying around.
Right.
And then the other views that we show are at eye level, the way that one typically sees it.
That's
It's
great.
not at that drone level.
So if we could just get kind of situated with what were the parameters that you put into establishing these drawings so that we could get the sense of size and volume and placement.
Sounds good. Should we go to?
And there's one other question. When, on page 5, you were talking about making it cheaper. I think it's on the tailored utilities review and requirements. I'd like to know how that aligns with council desire to make development pay for itself. And if that is being focused at developers or at individual owners who are redeveloping their own home. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. It's 4.5 minutes. Mayor Pro Tem.
For context.
I'm sorry, did you want to get the answer to that question now?
No, I'm fine with them giving it to us later, but if you have an answer, that'd be great.
And this was in regards to the Planning Commission recommendation for tailored utility requirements. Well, I think that I think there's a lot of different approaches to that recommendation, but I think one of them is simply looking at the sizing of easements and being a little bit more tailored about how utility easements are applied and required on particular projects. And I think that, the degree to which staff will be able to address that as part of this process remains to be seen. We definitely have proposed that going forward, following code adoption, there be an interdepartmental work group assembled to really look at utility requirements over a broad category of developments and look at ways that we can improve them. There was a joint statement from the utility providers and members of the LDC team that was included in the October 4th staff report. And so I think this relates to that, but it will remain to be seen if we can implement this as part of the code rewrite. But it was definitely an issue that the Planning Commission emphasized in a few of their recommendations.
Is that the same with the first one of their recommendations about generally increased transition area depth and intensity on the corridors? Because that's like going the other direction from what we're hearing residents emphatically saying, that there's too much density and intensity and too deep of a transition area along the corridors. So that seems to be coming at it from exactly the opposite, 180
I
degrees
believe-
from what we're hearing the residents say.
I believe that this recommendation was not so much directed at just sort of expanding the depth as a general matter, so much as looking at the corridor, the 2016 Mobility Bond Program as a guiding criteria for the placement of transition areas, and not so much just a blanket direction to expand the transition areas.
Yeah, it was more, I took it as an interpretation of more in comparison of balancing all of the things that we've heard with regards to reducing against residential corridors, that we should be mindful in however we expand or reduce, that we should be mindful that the largest amount of area should be adjacent to where we have mobility funding going. So just in relation to each other is
Okay,
more
well,
how I took that.
That aligns with what we have been saying
Yes.
from day one. Okay, so this very first recommendation is in fact them affirming the direction that the council had put forward?
I don't want to speak for what they were intending. I have to look at the transcript closer, but generally I got the sense that they just wanted to make sure with balancing all of the other things, they were also sensitive to areas vulnerable to gentrification and wanting us to look closer there as well with tools, but to assure that where the greatest area is mapped, that it would be in the areas that are consistent with our investments. So,
Okay, and then
yeah.
just my last question is, did they talk in terms of how this plan aligns, as state law requires, with our comprehensive plan?
I do not believe that they passed any motions or recommendations on that issue. They did vote to incorporate the October 25th supplemental staff report into their recommendation, and that includes the proposed amendment to the growth concept map in Imagine Austin. And as Anik mentioned, we intend, as part of the next supplemental, to provide kind of a fuller discussion about sort of the former Title 25 zoning district, how that relates to neighborhood plans, NCCDs, neighborhood plan combining districts, and sort of the full range of different kind of related ordinances that the city has used over time. But I do not believe the commission passed a recommendation directly on that issue. We'll review the transcript to make sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was 9 minutes. Mayor Pro Tem?
On slide 8, I'm just trying to understand the context to the other. So is where it says existing fourplex behind that, is that the corridor behind that where those taller buildings are?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Yeah, so that where it says existing fourplex?
And
Yeah.
then there's a taller building behind it. That's
Yeah.
the side of the corridor.
Mhm.
And did you say that you said there's very little RM1? I thought
Right, so
Okay.
of the transition areas, they're comprised of RM1 zones and R4 zones. And in terms of the number of lots that would typically get mapped, so for example, let's say all criteria were met and we go 5 lots deep, typically the RM1s would be mapped 2 of those 5, and the R4 would have been mapped 3 of the 5.
okay. And then
And-
go ahead.
I'm sorry. And then remember also that in cases where areas vulnerable, the RM1 is not even used at all. So
Okay.
the transition is just the R4 zone.
And so in this case, the very next block, is that RM1 or is that R4?
In the next block, yeah,
Like this one. Is this one RM1 or R4?
that would still be RM1, and then it turns to R4. Yeah.
Okay, and I thank you for the canopy of the McMansion, which illustrates you could actually go bigger, but it would only be one house, as opposed to possibly a unit of 3 or more units, smaller than what would be allowed right now under the current code. Is that what that's
That's
supposed to? Okay. And then I just want to say I think we need to be careful about asking our staff to do things to compare to what non-staff folks are doing. And I tremendously appreciate the perspective of this is how somebody experiences it, because that's exactly what I especially appreciated the comment about this is not the theoretical worst case scenario. So thank you for these renderings.
Thank you. It's 2.5 minutes. Greg.
Thank you all for the presentation, and I appreciate many of the suggestions that staff is making for further refinement. Before we send this out to anyone, I think that what you all were saying when you went through the slides is really helpful, and I want to make sure that I'm saying accurately what you all said. So on slide 9, for example, I think what I heard Peter say, but I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent anything, is that that even if this building with the balconies is technically buildable right now before the staff make their edits, it sounded like you were saying that somebody building this much outdoor space versus indoor space is very unlikely, if infeasible.
Yeah, so as the staff reviewed this one, it's a lot of outdoor space, right? So when you look at the floor area, I think the calculation of one that we saw that was submitted showed somewhere near 75% of the floor area. So the outdoor space comprised about 75% of sort of the amount of the indoor space, which is, I mean, it's someone who really loves being outside, but it also means it's a lot of roof exposing lower floors and so forth. So, but in doing so, what happens is the FAR, if one's stuck with the FAR and the height as it was proposed, in theory, one could build a very tall building that has smaller footprints per floor, but gets up higher, right, and a lot of outdoor space. Nevertheless, what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a 5-unit building in an RM1 versus the 3-unit building that's modeled, the taller one. And so it's possible to, under the current code, to get 5 units at scale, right, that is not significantly bigger. Nevertheless, and could you advance it to the next slide? So,
I just want to make sure
yes.
I can describe that.
Yes.
I know that
Yes,
you
yes.
then are making changes from what you said that would get us to the next slide. But I want to make sure that people understand what is on this slide. Because you said it, but you were trying to get through your presentation quickly, and I appreciate that.
Okay.
What you're saying is the building that is on the right side of the screen, the shorter building, is 5 units, and then that's more generally what you thought would get built compared to the 75% balconies building. So is it accurate to say that 75% balconies building, you're showing us that technically, while somebody could build that, most people don't build something that's that much balcony, and you aren't really anticipating that anybody would do that. But just in case they are interested for some reason in building something that looks like that, as opposed to 5 units that look like the other building, you all are considering refinements, which are on the next slide. Is that right?
And may I say that, again, the RM1 is the zone adjacent to the corridor zone. Might be across an alley, but it's the one right next to the corridor zone. So it isn't so much, I just want to be clear about it, it isn't so much the height. It isn't so much the height, because even if one were to build a 4-story building like this, adjacent to a Main Street building that was 60 feet high, that would provide the transition that council is calling for, right? The reason why we're adjusting the FAR has to do with reducing the likelihood of fewer units that are much larger getting built, and to really put a governor on, right, and disincentivize, if you will, a duplex or a triplex getting built in an RM1, and really privileging the ability to provide more units in the RM1.
Right. You keep jumping to the next slide question, which is a great one, but
Okay.
just to understand this one, it's not, you are making suggestions so that we privilege more smaller units as opposed to bigger ones.
Correct.
And making adjustments, and that frankly, what you've also described is you are not generally testing and building a world of worst case scenarios where somebody decides to do 75% balcony space. But you're showing us that anyways, just to show us how you would, just to show what somebody could do if they wanted to do that. right? In case for some reason somebody chose to do that.
Correct.
Right. And so then the next slide, if I were to want to describe what these are, is given what staff wants to present to us as some of your recommendations, still what's more likely to be built would be the 5 smaller units right next to the corridor, which is the building that looks closer to us on the right. But if somebody wanted to do a bunch of balconies still, because that was their thing, then with your adjustments, it might look a little bit more like the building, the picture there.
Yeah. And again, I just want to be clear that this adjustment that's being proposed, if one does 3 units, so ratcheting the FAR from 0.8 as it is in October 4th draft to 0.6, it doesn't, we are not, at this point, limiting the height. So again, if one wanted to make that other building at a 0.6 FAR and 4 stories, it would be a lot less square footage per floor. It's a very inefficient way of building a building, right? But again, it's not so much the height that is the concern as much as the unit, getting the smaller unit.
And that makes sense to me. That was the very first edit that I posted on the message board and wanted to see in the code, was that as people graduate to more units, that we try to incentivize those being smaller rather than all of that being taken up by one big one. I just think that then to folks that want to see drawings of what transition zones might look like, that staff showing this makes sense to me. And I hope that maybe even if they're, I know they're labeled as under consideration, but if we can make sure that people understand what one means versus the other, and if people still want to do large amounts of balconies, I guess in this case they still could, but it definitely looks better than the previous slide, and so I appreciate the changes.
Okay, 7 minutes. Allison.
Thank you. I wanted to just say I really appreciate the modeling. I think the modeling is really important for us to visualize what could be. I had some questions on it with respect to the adjustments, and I think some of the adjustments with respect to FAR and certainly in the right direction and where we were hoping to go by having the modeling that's out there in the community. I wanted to confirm that you also be looking at adjustments for the R3 zones, not just to R2. You only mentioned R2. I don't know why I'm echoing.
I don't know that we've been looking at adjustments to R3, but we could certainly double check and see if there's anything along the same lines of what we've been hearing from the community that would apply. We will take a second look, absolutely.
Okay, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that these were both to R2 and R3 because I have parts of my district that are R3 that were modeled that I think we need to look at this as well. So I appreciate that we have these districts modeled. Will you be looking at the other districts in the same way? The visuals are really what help us to understand what we have to do in terms of the FAR and other kinds of things. But we haven't seen those for the RM2 to RM5 and the MU and MS. So will we be seeing those models, being able to have similar lessons as to what we're doing? And they could go in either direction, but
yes, we will. Yes, the answer would be yes.
And then in the models that you've presented in these diagrams, I'm not sure I would call them maps. I think that might get a little dangerous with people. Are you maxing out entitlements in the examples?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, are your corridor examples maxed out along the corridor? The size on the corridors, have those been maxed out?
Let me just make sure I know what you're talking about. So the Main Street buildings, the back of the Main Street buildings?
Yes.
So the one on the right is an example from testing, and that's showing current code subject to compatibility, and then the one on the left is showing a 65-foot Main Street building, and that is maxed out.
So just to be clear, the one on the right is the building just below the label that says 5 units RM1. So there's a building that has a step down.
Okay.
So that is an example of what one can do under the current code if it was subject to compatibility, right? And then the larger building, taller building, demonstrates a maxed out Main Street building that is not subject to compatibility per council direction when adjacent to transition areas.
But none of these consider the bonuses.
That is the Main Street.
That's a Main Street 2 with bonus, yeah.
Okay, so the one on the left has a bonus, but in terms of the RMs and the R4s in these examples, do any of them have bonuses?
No.
Okay, so do we know what happens with the bonuses when we model these out?
Yeah, again, we have some of those examples. The bonuses in this size site, the units get smaller.
Okay, I think it'd be helpful to see those as well. And as you're presenting those, if you can make sure that you max out entitlements. My experience here in Austin is that people are going to max out the entitlements. And I don't want to spend much time on it, but Greg, it's an office building, not a residential, that has all these balconies. I don't know that it's 75%, but it has way more balconies than you might expect, and it's a pretty cool building. So I would expect that people would be building that out if they could get that outdoor space and make more money in the process, if we don't change things.
What I picked up from your comments is some more modeling that includes more variation on with bonus, without bonus, and maxing out, just to be clear.
Yes, and on my earlier question, though, was we also need to model the other zones. So we're only...
R2,
we're only
R3.
Yeah, and MS and MU and RM2 to 5, all of those need to be... so far we've modeled the ones that the community has modeled as well in terms of these examples. And we don't have, the folks in the community don't have the bandwidth to do all of the other models, to push this forward. So I would like to ask that you guys go ahead and do that and do a similar exercise. I think we'll learn a lot, and it may be that things go in different directions depending on what you're looking at, if it's commercial or whatnot. But we won't know any of that unless we model it.
And we have modeled the Main Street and mixed-use zones. Again, we're showing you a sample of, again, the things that seem to be of great interest. So we highlighted for today those topics.
I appreciate that, but as a policymaker, the visuals are really helpful to me to be able to understand what kind of building that we're incentivizing. So I'd appreciate seeing those.
Okay. That's about 5.5 minutes. Colleagues, some of you weren't here when we started off. We worked through how much time we had available, if we were going to actually be able to touch on topics by one. It comes out to roughly about 14 minutes a person to be able to hit areas, not including the last 30 minutes, which we would spend on process for the first reading.
Can I just clarify one thing? I think I said R3, and I meant to go to the 2A and the 3A, not the R3. So I apologize for that.
Got it. Paige.
I appreciate the comments on kind of the compactness and square footage that Greg and y'all were having a conversation about. Were there other considerations to suggesting changing duplexes from 0.6 to 0.4? It seems to me that there's kind of a big shift between 2,100 square feet per unit to 1,000, if I wrote my numbers down correctly. I'm kind of approaching this from a standpoint of who lives in these units and who, if it's 1,000 square feet, that seems kind of tight for families with, maybe 2 or more kids. And I just kind of wanted to think about the reasoning behind kind of suggesting that lower square footage, even though I'm on board with compact and connected. I was just kind of curious about that thought process.
Yeah. So the going to the 0.4, right? Bringing it back to 0.4 for the duplex on a typical 7,000 square foot lot would allow 1,400 square feet per unit, right? 2,800 square feet total.
Okay.
1,400 square feet per unit. When we look at the minimum lot area in this zone, which is at 5,000 square feet, at .4, that's 2,000 square feet in total. So that is where you would end up with an average of 1,000 square feet per unit. And so this is where the additional thing that we mentioned is on lots less than 7,000 square feet, perhaps the language could speak to .4 or 1,500 square feet, whichever is larger. So if I had a smaller lot and my FAR was bringing down really what is more, let's say, usable square footage for a unit, the code would allow that greater amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is the approach generally? Just trying not to have buildings that looked too large, just for character and context of different neighborhoods.
Yeah. So the idea is really to discourage the under development in terms of your capacity goals, right? So, if, for example, the FAR for a duplex was so low, I might just build the single unit. In other words, to build a duplex, those two units that are small and not as desirable on the market, I might just choose to do one big house and sell that. Mm-hmm. So we're really trying to figure out strike that right balance between what is a viable size of a unit and then calibrating the FAR by that.
I appreciate that. I know our goal is to get more units, and I know Anik spoke to keeping an eye on that. Originally 405,000 units, now it's about 397, so I appreciate y'all just kind of being mindful of that.
It's 3.25 minutes. Kathy?
Understand it, we get 14 minutes total for the work session, and you're deducting from our 14 for what we spend on each section?
Yes.
Okay.
And plus the process time is 30 minutes at the end.
Thanks. So I'm going to have to make my question super quick. Thank you. Thanks for the modeling. I agree that it's helpful. I would like to add, and this overlaps with some of the requests you've heard, I would like to see a slide with the perspective of 9, of what we see on slide 9, if we could go there for a minute. I would like to see that mapped with 6 units. I see that this RM1 is mapped at 3 units, but the baseline is 6 for that category, and I think we need to see what 6 looks like on this tract, and I think we need to see what 10 looks like on this tract. And I don't know whether, just in looking through, I'm not sure that there are any models that actually show us what the maximum, this built out to the maximum entitlements with both the baseline number as well as the density bonus, with the density bonus. And I really believe that with the price of real estate the way it is, that we're going to see when the tracts redevelop at the maximum of their entitlements, not the minimum. So I would also like to see that with, I'd like to see that perspective with existing one-story houses on either side, because that is the conditions on the ground in some of the areas that I represent that have been mapped for RM1. And so I think it's very helpful as we try to communicate with our community members about what this would look like or could look like on the ground. I think it is important for them to see that mapped with the existing entitlements. And then I'd like to just circle back to a couple things that have come up before. As you talked about some of the recommendations that will be coming out in the report on November 25th, I want to be really clear on whether there are any other changes proposed for, I know, Mr. Parks, you mentioned a few times that in the transition zones, typically 2 of the 5 have been mapped for RM1 and 3 of the 5 have been mapped for R2. As I've mentioned in every session, R4. Yeah, thank you. I keep getting the codes confused. As I've mentioned in every work session we've had, that just isn't the case in most of the areas I represent. It is, and we can continue to have this conversation, but I think at some point, I hope we have enough minutes allocated to council members to really talk about that. That while that may be true in some of the other council districts, there are 14 tracks, 16 tracks. I mean, there are the instances where there are 2 to 5, where we've actually mapped, where you have actually mapped 2 to 5, are very few. So is the intention then to
standardize that and make that 2 to 5 in all the transition zones? Is that something that we'll be able to? Can I let the community members know that that's a recommendation that is going to come back in the report, that those actually be standardized so that every district that has transition zones mapped be within that council direction of 2 to 5?
At this point, we're not recommending changing our criteria. We are recommending reductions based on context, but not to the criteria that we applied, which
So-
was to be equitable with all of the different unique and complicated configurations of our streets and frontage. So at this point, we're not looking at a different criteria, but we are looking at context-sensitive reductions.
Do you have a sense of whether any of those will happen in any of the multitude of areas where they far exceed 5?
Yes.
In District 9?
It will have the effect of reductions, yes.
Okay.
But I couldn't tell you at this point how much and whether it would go down to 5, for example. It may in some areas when we look at the reductions that we are teeing up and also looking at what the Planning Commission recommended and fine-tuning what we put out on the 25th.
Again, I hope that we can find time within this group to really address that. I don't think we ever, I mean, the council direction to do 2 to 5 never said if it's 2 to 5 on this side and then the equivalent space on the other equals 15, map 15 tracts on the other side. So I contend that that should be addressed. And as that is the proposal at the moment, I would like to request that we have some mapping of those areas, and I can potentially suggest a few so that we can see what that looks like, what that could look like on the ground if you had redevelopment of a significant number of tracts where you have, currently one-story houses and ADUs or duplexes or very small scale 4 units kinds of complexes, and then, for areas back mapped to have between 6 and 10, and then 4 to 8 units behind it, so that people can get a realistic sense of the extent of the changes that are being suggested in very particular areas of the city, but not citywide. And then have you contemplated, did the Planning Commission recommend any kinds of recommendations that would prevent against the accumulation of lots? So along some of these areas where you have RM zoning, my thought is that on some of these tracts which are currently, basic 5,500 square foot lots, that it would be hard to achieve 10 units in that space. However, it might be more likely you could achieve 20 if you aggregated it with the lot next to it. So have you contemplated that? Are there any recommendations that would prevent against that so that we don't have these tracts just, adding 2 and 3 and creating, just redeveloping them all together?
So
as much larger scale apartment complexes, which was not the intent of the direction.
So in the staff proposal that came out on October 25th, which Planning Commission incorporated, we included, based on community feedback, a recommendation that the use of unified development agreements which is basically a tool that the city has long had in place that allows, in certain instances, lots to be treated as a single site, that be limited to 2 lots. So we included a limitation on that for the transition area zones. But then as far as preventing the subdivision process from being used, we have not looked at that, and that would, I think, be a difficult thing to do. But certainly the subdivision process opens a development up to, that's a more extensive process than just using a unified development agreement. And in recognition of sort of the potential that UDAs, if not limited, could be used to really create a very extremely dense pattern of development, we proactively propose to limit that to 2.
To 2. Okay, thank you. I missed that change in your report. Then I think that that would be the third request I have in terms of a modeling, that we see what that looks like to have lots to aggregated, and then again, the maximum built out on those, the maximum number of units that is included within the baseline, and then with the affordable housing bonus. Thanks very much. I know that you're working and getting lots of good recommendations from our preservation community about the preservation incentive, and I hope that that's, and I have some ideas about that as well based on my conversations. I think it's very important, and it sounds like the will that everyone has to really make sure that that preservation incentive truly preserves the existing structure for a reasonable period of time. And so I hope that we can, too, talk about what that looks like when people violate it, so that we don't have a situation where, you know, all of those walls are suddenly gone or they're mostly gone, and then, you know, development proceeds on there. And so one thing that I think should be considered is what the impact is on your ability to actually use the other structures on that site. If you've made use of the preservation incentive, I think you ought, and then you go ahead and violate it or demolish more of the house than is allowed, I think it should be we should have very tight restrictions, including potentially you can't get a certificate of occupancy for that third structure. The second one, I think you should, because in most cases you already have the ability to do 2 units on that site. But if you're using the preservation incentive, well, not actually, that's not the case for many of our SF2 properties that would be converting to allow 3 with the preservation bonus. But anyway, something along those lines I think should be important to really make sure that our preservation bonus has teeth.
Thank you. 9.5 minutes. I think Kathy brings up kind of the gaming of the system issue with respect to tearing down and leaving 2 studs up, and that's a recurrent thing that I see here as well. And maybe there's a way for us to catalog those things, the gaming and things that feel like abuse to us. There's also the one where you build a duplex, but one of the sides of the duplex really isn't anything other than a wet bar pool room for the duplex, and it's really small, and it's not really a dwelling. I've read the definition of dwelling. Maybe that needs to be tightened up, although reading it, I'm not sure how you do that, and I'm not sure how someone gets away with doing the pool house with the definition we already have. But to keep track of those kinds of gaming things, so that, because I think those are real touch points in the community. P.O.
Thank you.
By the way, that was an additional minute for me. Go ahead, P.O.
My question is, and I really want to thank y'all for all that information that y'all giving us. And I've learned a lot, but I'm curious. What do you mean about R3 corner lots? What are those?
R3 is a zone that allows 3 units by right, up to 3 units. It's a residential scale zone. And what we learned from testing is that because corner lots, the way they're configured, a lot of the times they're a bit larger, and also configured in a different way, that they lend themselves to full use of the R3. And so that would be a good way to subtly add more capacity throughout our city. And I'll ask Peter to add to that if you would like.
Just as a way of following council direction in high opportunity areas to find opportunities for missing middle, because of the attributes of corners, as Anik was just describing. This is what it also would allow then is the design of 3 units, let's say. 1 unit might face one street and 2 units faces the other street. So it really is from a design perspective, it's actually a very useful way to scale down essentially the effect of buildings on these corner conditions.
Okay. And this new code also is like if you have an ADU, and back then when you were building them, they required parking garages on the bottom floor. You couldn't build livable space on the first floor. You only could have done it on the second floor if you were building a garage apartment. Are we doing away with the requirement of keeping those garage apartments? I mean, the garage itself?
You're on. No, you're off. On.
Sorry, I couldn't see the red.
That's okay.
Lindy Garwood, Planning and Zoning. Yes, we've removed the requirement of where the ADU can be placed on the lot, including it can be inside, outside, attached, not attached, and it doesn't have to be above the garage. It can just be on the ground floor if you wanted it to be.
Okay, and also on the single-family houses that have garages, there's people that have been converting them into rooms. Are they going to be able to do that? I mean, right now, I don't think it's legal, but they have closed off their garages and converted them into a room, basic living room. Do you know if that's going to be allowed or?
I believe garage conversions is something that we're still looking into. If you did a building permit and got all your requirements, it could be an internal ADU, but I know that there was some questions about garage conversions a few years ago, so we can look further into that. But internal ADUs are definitely allowed. So if you converted your garage with a building permit, that would be permitted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Renteria, I think that as long as there was a way to accommodate parking and all the other regulatory requirements, but I mean for the overall site, a garage conversion would be possible, but you'd have to make sure that doing that didn't render you in violation of other requirements.
Thank you.
Okay. 3 3/4 minutes. All right, so I'm going to now move us, again, obviously everybody can use the time however they want to. Oh, I'm sorry, Ann, I didn't see your light was on. Okay, go ahead.
And I'm sorry I was late, but I'm focusing on asking them about
That's fine. You have 14 minutes. You can use it however you want to.
All right, a quick question on slide 21 about the transition areas. I'm trying to compare real quickly, but you're using a different term here. You're talking about reducing transition areas in susceptible, early, and dynamic stages of gentrification, which is a different term than what we used in our council direction. I don't think there's a difference in looking at the maps, but I can't quite tell. Can you just tell me if there's a difference between using these titles and using the term vulnerable, which is what we used in our direction?
Yes, there is quite a difference. So
there's a difference from geography perspective?
Yeah.
Okay, then my question is, why are you using different criteria than what we specified in our direction?
Well, allow me to clarify. The vulnerable area is the umbrella for which susceptible, early, and dynamic lie within. So we are absolutely following the council direction to use vulnerable areas. In our October 4th release, we used vulnerable areas as the way to describe the geography, and it's an immense geography in the Eastern Crescent and some other sparse areas, census tracts. And if you dig into the report, there are geographies within that whole swath of an umbrella of areas vulnerable to displacement as part of gentrification, and they're in varying stages, and there's 5 stages. It goes from susceptible.
I have it right here. I'm looking at it. I understand all that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just because our time is tight. So what I'm really trying to understand is I understand these are a subset of vulnerable. So my question is, by taking this subset, are you missing some areas of geography that are on the other map? Because there's 2 maps. There's a vulnerable map and there's a gentrification map. So you can go back and check if you're not clear right now. But that's what I'm trying to understand, because I'm looking back and forth between the 2 maps right now, and there seem to be some differences in geography between them, depending on which map you use. And so that's really just my question is, am I reading that right? And are there differences? And if so, are you leaving out areas that you would if they were vulnerable, or are you adding areas? So that's what I'm trying to understand. And, you can answer that offline if you're not entirely clear right now. Or it sounds like,
we'll get back.
Looks like you might,
So really quickly, Erica Leak, Neighborhood Housing. I have discussed this with the authors of Uprooted, and there is a difference between the vulnerable areas, which basically are places where there are vulnerable populations at a higher rate, but those areas may not be gentrifying. And so the other maps with susceptible, et cetera, those are places that are currently gentrifying. So that's the difference.
Okay, but I noticed that you don't include all of the categories that are on the gentrification map. So you chose some of the categories that are on the gentrification map, but you include the one that says continued loss, for example. You only included the susceptible, early, and dynamic. So you didn't include them all.
Initially, we did, and we did.
Okay.
As we did not map as much or as intense zones in all of the areas, but when we're talking about, so further reduced might be a better word in front of that second bullet, and that is the language we used in the October 25th report.
Okay.
Is that as we continue to get input from the community and concerns in October, we wanted to look at further reducing, and when we looked at how we might do that, which is great, I'm glad you're asking these questions, because that's the point of, as we move towards November 25th, is to look at these areas that give us more information. That's why these three are listed. But we would still have them and continue the approach that we took in the later stages.
Okay, so why would you not further reduce in the continued loss area? Because that's one of the areas on gentrification.
Laura Keating, Planning and Zoning. So the continued loss areas are not identified as vulnerable in the study. So those did not get the vulnerable transition area zoning late, and then the rest of them got the just R4 zoning.
Okay, that's what was confusing me, because so there's areas on the gentrification map that weren't mapped at the lower end because they weren't on the vulnerable map. Am I understanding? Okay. So now you're further reducing the areas that you used before from the vulnerable map. Is that am I understanding correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
So the late stage, which is on the vulnerable map, would stay the same, and we would further reduce in dynamic, early, and susceptible.
Yeah, those aren't on the vulnerable map. They're on the gentrification map. But I hear what you're saying.
But the overlap between those is 100%.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time? I think
So susceptible to late on the gentrification map, which includes susceptible, early, dynamic, late, are identified as vulnerable.
Okay.
Continued loss is the only gentrification stage that's not identified as vulnerable on the vulnerable map.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That makes it clear. So, and then I just wanted to mark that I would like to have a conversation, as Councilmember Tovo said, about the 2 to 5 lots, and I just want to mark that. I think we need to find a time to talk about that, because I'm seeing the same thing in some of my areas where it is deeper than 2 to 5 lots, and it's deeper in areas that are vulnerable. So.
Okay, further discussion? All right, just by way of prompt, we had 6 areas, and I'll just call these areas. Again, you have the time that you have to use. Residential house scale zones, transition zones, residential multi-unit, mixed use, Main Street, and the other zones. The 4th is affordable housing, density bonuses and the like. 5th one is non-zoning, which would be drainage, water quality. And then the process within the code itself, site plan, subdivision, variances, appeals, and that kind of stuff. Again, you don't have to speak on every area if you don't want to, and you can use your time however you want to. But the prompt right now is the residential house scale zones for people to ask questions. I was with some people in the neighborhood the other day, and they were commenting that we had done a good job of not upzoning existing housing stock that had multiple units. But there was a cutoff point where we stopped, and below that we didn't preserve those units. And one of the questions was, does it make sense for us to try harder or take a more specific look, or as part of our process between December and February, identifying where there might be a quad somewhere that we want to also seek to preserve by not upzoning. Can you talk about that issue? What we did with respect to that and what the thinking was? Did my question not make sense?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so our CoStar, the data that we used only captures 5 units and higher, and that was the data that was available to us to not upzone what we could think of as market rate affordable multi-unit communities. And so we can look to additional data as we continue to fine tune where there might be existing fourplexes, as you said, or triplexes, as you said. I think we need every inch of preservation that we can get, so we could certainly see, working with our housing department, how we might do that, and real estate department.
Great, thank you.
Mayor,
Yes.
if I may, I know in some of the neighborhoods I represent, they were very careful and did inventories of their housing stock in the last 3 or 4 months, and so I think this is an example of where the community and the people who actually live in the neighborhoods can be of extreme value in helping provide that level of information and data.
Thank you for that reminder. I do have maps from many in Hancock and Hyde Park who did submit, and we will look at those as well as what additional data we might find.
Yeah, and I know Heritage also has mapped their inventory in some of the other neighborhoods as well. So
Zilker as well.
As we've in the past done that kind of context-based planning where we've invited the people who live in an area and work in an area or have businesses in an area to come in and provide information. I think this is a place where we need to make room for that kind of community-based planning.
Okay, 3/4. Jimmy?
One mapping thing related to house scale residential. There are a handful of tiny little condo developments that were developed under SF6 that resulted in individually platted lots, not a contiguous condo regime that got mapped into R4 in areas where there is no R3, where there is no transit, where there is no other types of reasons to have R4. And it would be good to go back and think, should those be like an R2C that have a smaller lot size when it's to make more contiguous with our other objectives. And I've got those specifically in Canyon Creek and in River Place. But in other areas where the SF6 was not individually platted, I think it appropriately got RM1. So I think this is just kind of an interesting SF6 translation issue.
3/4. Other comments? Greg?
I appreciate the refinement of the preservation bonus and preservation incentive. I said this in the last work session, but I just really would love the staff's help and people that are modeling and testing this help to really try to make it work. I mean, it's something that a lot of people seem to have a lot of energy and excitement around adding that kind of housing into the city, and so I just want to reinforce that I think it has a lot of promise, and everybody putting work together on it makes sense to me.
Okay, it's 1/4. Anybody else want to speak to this topic while we have folks here?
Which topic,
Ann?
sir?
I was just on the residential house
Oh.
scale zones, texts and maps. I was in one of our downtown neighborhoods, been out in neighborhoods, and someone asked the question as to couldn't we make this whole thing simpler by just doing R3 throughout the city? And just doing R3 throughout the city. And I don't know how that would impact any of the numbers. I don't know how crazy an idea that would be because I haven't looked at it at all. But I just throw that out there because I hadn't heard anybody suggest that simplicity.
We have not looked at that, but we certainly can discuss it.
Just don't know what that would do to yields in the city overall. And I just know. So I just throw that out. I haven't looked at it. Kathy?
I'm interested in thinking about that kind of an approach. I think that is as I thought about it, the current R2 that once it creates provisions for that front structure to actually remain so that we're not losing our existing housing stock, but you're allowing people to add 2 units to the back in a way that, as we've talked about all along, adds invisible density, I think would have far less impact on the wholesale redevelopment of certain areas than going to the RM1 and R4. And so I think that kind of an approach, I think, is a much better one. I had another question, but I'm not going to. It's not immediately on my head, so I'm not.
Okay. 1/4. Anything else on this prompt? Yes, Allison.
Thank you. I think your models cover the need to recalibrate the FAR, and we've had a lot of conversation about the size. I just wanted to inject some history that I've been digging into a little bit more, which is the history of the McMansion ordinance. Back in, I think it was 2006, the council actually declared an emergency for something like 7 months because the houses were too big. But it wasn't just single-family houses; it was duplexes that were too big, and it was more that the duplexes were too big than the single families. And we have to just keep in mind that the McMansion ordinance was not about aesthetics. We think of it that way now in hindsight, but it was about compatibility. It was about the economic and the physical. And there's lessons that we can learn from that for how we are thinking about the kind of duplexes that we're getting. Whether these are going to be economic and affordable, and how big do they actually need to be to achieve our goals. And the bigger we make them, the less they meet our goals in terms of affordability, because bigger is more expensive. And there was such an outcry in 2006 over the size of duplexes that they had to call an emergency. And so I just want to underscore that as we're thinking about calibrating, that we need to remember the history of where we got here so that we can do better moving forward.
Okay, 1.5 minutes. Anybody else on this prompt? Okay. The next prompt we had was to talk about transition zones. Does anybody want to comment on transition zones? Leslie?
Yeah, just to follow up on some of the comments that we've all made already this morning, I'd like to see staff redistribute the transition areas to align with the growth concept maps that are attached to our comprehensive plan. These would be for areas that aren't currently zoned F25 or that have existing regulating plans like Robinson Ranch, North Burnett Gateway. This is, because I'm looking at the missing middle piece and looking for the equitable distribution between the R4 and the RM1. There are some districts that don't get very much. If we move in the direction that the mayor just mentioned, which is to zone everything RM3, then that, I think, would deal with equitability because everybody would be treated the same. But right now, the way the zones are distributed and the missing middle housing is not equitable. So if you guys could focus on that, that just is a re-teeing up of a request already made. And then we have the population projections from our demographer for the next 10 to 40 years. And you need to be looking at where the population is expected to really tick up over the next 10 to 40 years when we are pulling these. And that should be informing the equitable distribution question. You all have a copy of the demographer's population projections, I'm hoping.
Yes, we have access to the
Okay, great. We might also want to put that up on the LDC website, the link for that. So, and that, that speaks to our concerns about access from transit with our corridors and how much housing is being built in areas where we have a locus of activity, like our regional centers are our town centers. Thanks.
There's 1.75 minutes. Anything else on transition zones?
I have a quick one. Councilmember Poole,
Come right back to
is that based off of our current land use planning, or is it? I haven't looked at it. I apologize.
So the demographer uses census data.
Okay.
So these are population numbers that, according to the footnotes, Census 2010 data used to draw council districts in 2013 and consequently reflect the population gained from annexations during that period. And then he has other footnotes in here. Ryan Robinson is the one who is tasked by the city to do these presentations or these data assumptions, and this would also be informing the conversations that I think the redistricting folks will be having in about a year or so. But everybody should have this. I think it was sent out to everyone.
That was exactly my thought, was that we're currently going through that process. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Okay, that's 3/4. Ann.
I wanted to drill down and make sure I'm understanding the criteria that are applied for the transition zones, because we were talking earlier that it wasn't there was some complexity to the 2 to 5 lots. So in other words, it wasn't just the 2 to 5 lots. So and I understand that at this point in time you're not going to actually change the criteria, but you're looking more at some context sensitivity. So help me understand why you wouldn't change the criteria, and I don't mean that as a you should. I'm just trying to understand the thinking. What is the thinking around not changing the criteria? In other words, what does the criteria get us in terms of our goals that would make you say that you wouldn't consider actually changing the criteria back to just 2 to 5 lots? Is my question clear?
Yeah, the question's clear. Well, right now, given that we have the capacity analysis and where it stands, we are focused on looking at the context sensitivity and how we might further reduce in response to the comments we've heard here and from the community as well about the 2 to 5 lots, and then have a further conversation from there and see how we can, like I said earlier, make up for that capacity in other ways that are acceptable and in line with what we've heard from the community that might be acceptable and from you all. And so that would be the thinking, and also that we're still trying to, we have a slide that we're trying to bring up, but I don't know if we can, about that we showed at Planning Commission about the equitable nature of the process that we used. And so if we can get it up as soon as the folks come back, we will try to do that and bring it back.
Okay, so does that mean, I'm trying to understand, does that mean that you're thinking that if you just kept 2 to 5 lots, that wouldn't be enough capacity? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. That wouldn't be enough capacity as opposed to yield?
Correct.
Okay. Using the way that you've analyzed capacity currently?
Correct.
Okay. Which is something for another discussion, because I'm concerned that the way that capacity has been counted, that it's actually giving us yield. And so we're comparing yield numbers to a target that the council set as capacity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can get in, that's not on our calendar right now to talk about capacity, but I'm just teeing up that that's something that I want to have a conversation about. So let me ask you the other question then. So just so I understand, is this, you brought it up on the, I want to understand what you mean by equitable and is...
Yeah, we're going to show you a slide right now.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
You can do it, Peter.
Okay. So here's the situation of if we had a perfect grid, so the corridor and then the current SF residential right behind the corridor, council direction was 2 to 5 lots, depending on how many criteria are met. So, for example, if all criteria are met, goes back 5 lots. It's a symmetrical corridor. If fewer criteria are met, 2 lots, and in areas most vulnerable, not using the RM1, but just with the lower density using the zone, the R4. And so as staff prepared the maps, they looked at this distance of sort of nearly what is sort sort of the equivalent of 5 lots deep. And what happens is if you take a bandwidth in that situation, on the one side, on your left side, you would end up with 35 missing middle lots. If we went literally 5 lots deep on the other side where the lots turn, you would get 10 missing middle lots. And so the way the staff looked at it is to say, how do we capture as equitable number of lots on either side of the corridor? And so if one counts, and again, on the right side, you see it is not literally 5 lots deep, it is more. But in terms of what it captures in that bandwidth along the corridor, it ends up, in this situation, 30. So what the staff has drawn here is lots that are the residential lots are exactly the same, but as the lot turns, you get a different result. If you literally count 5 lots on that side, this is how many you get on either side of the corridor versus this.
So what did you use as the average lot side to come up? Did you do this? Did you apply this everywhere, or were you using like an average lot size? I mean, in other words, does this distance actually vary depending on what's on the ground, or?
Yes. So we would look at a particular corridor, and we would look at the lot configuration on the left if it was present, and we would use that measurement along the corridor. And so that's why the depth varies from corridor to corridor. You're kind of looking if there is a condition of the corridor that looks like the left, where it's the long side of the lots, it's 5 lots deep, or 3 if we were doing 3 on that corridor, we would establish that distance, and then we would apply it elsewhere to all the other lot configurations along that corridor. So it had some context sensitivity to it.
Okay, so how did you decide which side of the corridor to count the 5 lots in? In other words, you could have matched the left side of the corridor to the right side of the corridor on there, but you didn't. You matched the right side to the left side. So how did you decide which side to use? I mean, what was the criteria to do that?
So as we started to look at the city, we found that the 3 to 5 lots using the long side of the parcel would still be within the walk shed to the corridor, and then would make it easy to give a certain range. So if you had the 5 lots on the right, where it's just the short side of the lot, on the other side it would be 1, maybe 2 lots, and you wouldn't be able to adjust based on lot configuration. But the primary reason was we were staying within that walk shed to the corridor.
Quarter mile, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's less than it's less than a 5-minute walk. The maximum was 850 feet, and so it's less than a 5-minute walk in all situations. So we applied those distances.
Okay, so really and I'm just trying to get down to the criteria. So the criteria that was applied was really the walk shed, not the 2 to 5, or it was a combination thereof.
Balance.
Okay. All right, then I'd like to see one of these where the streets come in at an angle. I don't know if y'all have that right now. So if you don't, we can
have it right now.
We can look at it later, but I'd like to see how it works coming in at an angle. And then, let's see. So, and by equitable, what is the thinking? What is the thinking and what's the criteria around both sides of the corridor have to be the same distance?
We're trying to maximize the walkability to the corridor where we're guiding growth to serve the corridor and the multimodal investments and other amenities on the corridor, while staying true to balancing the capacity analysis as well.
Okay, so it sounds to me like it's maybe more weighting on the walk shed aspect of it, than the 2 to 5 aspect of it, if you were having to weight those different.
I guess what I'm saying. Answer that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting into too much weeds here. I guess what I would love to see is if there is a written description of exactly how you applied, because I'm hearing different criteria and I'm hearing that you needed to balance and that sort of thing, and I appreciate all that. I'm just really trying to understand exactly what the criteria was and how it was balanced. So do you have something written that describes that?
Yes, it was one of our most recent or early on blogs.
Well, I apologize if I didn't see that, but I'm talking about in detail. What I would like to see is these are the 5 criteria that we used. This is how we weighted them, and this is how, so I can understand from a policy perspective. That's what I'm trying to get at. And I understand that our policy, the way we adopted things, didn't get down into the complexities of what's actually on the ground. So that when we said 2 to 5 lots, that was probably a more simple way of saying a policy without understanding all the, or not understanding, but without taking account for all the different complexities.
Okay.
So I get that. But I
Sure.
just want to understand, and I understand the staff needed to,
Right.
you had to look at the complexities. But there's
So
still.
you're 10 minutes now, so you're combined 17 and a half minutes. So let me move it around so other people get a chance to ask questions too.
Let me finish my request. My request is simply I would like to see that level of detail in a document that explains.
We have a technical document that we reduced for the blog, but we can send you the technical document.
Okay.
Kathy?
Thank you, Councilmember Kitchen. And I think that was a helpful dialogue. I think what is the general conversation around this is still not providing answers to the mapping that I'm seeing. And so even the 5 lots on one side equating to 14 on the other does not explain the mapping that I'm seeing in many areas. And so what I would suggest, I'm going to submit some areas to the Q&A portal, and I would encourage my colleagues, if you have areas that it's not clear how they met how the transition policy direction was applied, that we do that, and then we have a conversation about what the actual mapping looks like with relationship to this. And I especially since it sounds like some of the transition depths were extended to help meet the capacity objective. I think it's absolutely critical that we schedule very, very soon the topic that Councilmember Kitchen mentioned, that we really have a conversation in this room about the extent to which yield, the difference between yield and capacity. And I think what would help me, I asked questions about capacity through the Q&A, but I think what I really would like to know is how many properties are proposed for rezoning for those 2 transition zone categories, and the relationship between those total numbers of rezoned properties, district by district, and the yield. Because I think what I'm sensing from these conversations is that you have mapped far more than the yield. You have mapped far more than the capacity goals because we're assuming the yield is going to be smaller. And I think that's really what I need to better understand. So I will submit that as a Q&A. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate assumption that the proposed rezonings in the transition zone are more than the 397?
I don't understand the question, but you can submit it, and we'll ask for clarification if we need it.
Okay, thanks. But it just gets to the point that Councilmember Kitchen said, that there's a difference between the capacity objective that was in the policy document and the expected yield. And so I believe from the conversations we've had and the information we've gotten back so far, that what's been mapped is more than the capacity.
That's not my understanding, that's not my understanding.
Okay.
It's a more sophisticated feasibility study than just a raw calculation of the different zones and what could be produced by the raw acreage of those zones by unit. It definitely looked at land values and highest and best use, and so it's a very data-driven, sophisticated capacity analysis. But we still expect the yield would be less than the 397,000, and we can certainly explain that when you submit your question.
Okay, it's 3 minutes. Mayor Pro Tem.
I have concerns about the suggestion for y'all to look into R3 everywhere, because it's an interesting suggestion in that, there was a lot of talk about Minneapolis doing away with single family, and my assumption would be if we had started there, there'd be a lot of pushback. But now, seeing corridors and the intensity, now people are suggesting R3 everywhere, and I want to get us back to the goal of how this is supposed to align with the ASMP. And the whole purpose of these kinds of transition zones and this intensity of the corridors is to put people closer to transit, to get us closer to our 50-50 mode share. And this is not for staff, I'm looking at you, but this is more for my colleagues. To have people closer to grocery stores, to have people closer to parks. And so I think R3 everywhere is a great idea, but that doesn't mean we don't put more density on the corridors so people can live near things, and so council members are not pushing for 5 years to try to get a grocery store to people who've been asking for it for 10 years. That was the whole point. So R3 everywhere, great, but maybe that means a little less intensity, and that gets us to our housing goals number-wise. But I just want to bring us back to the purpose of this type of process was to get people closer, and it was to align with their 50-50 mode share. It was to fight congestion, get people off the roads, get them on our buses, and so I don't want staff to waste time going and seeing what R3 Everywhere is going to do, because that was not what we were trying to do ever, I don't think.
Thank you. It's a minute. Further discussion on transition zones. Could you address the residential corridor transition zone thinking now that you're going through?
Yes. So with the comments that we've heard, we are looking at the transit priority corridor, Imagine Austin corridors that are primarily residential in nature, and also looking at, per the Planning Commission recommendations, they also fine-tuned how we might look at Cap Metro's service and plan service, and not only looking at where there's residential frontage, but where the transit priority network maybe doesn't have as many stops and it's used as a turnaround, for example, and really getting more context sensitive in those areas for reductions. So there's a lot of work to be done on those residential corridors to reduce.
So one of the questions that I hear is on a residential corridor we have RM1 mapped and then we have R2 behind it. Is there any consideration to taking out the RM1 and just keeping it R2 on residential transit corridors and counting from that first one back as opposed to the others? Are you contemplating or looking at any of those issues? R4 rather.
Yes, so it would be both the reduction of the area by one lot, or potentially more. We'll have to look at the context, and then also by way of the zone and looking at reducing to R4 as well, where it might be appropriate. So
reducing, so not doing RM1 on the corridor and doing just beginning with R4, or no?
We're looking at both. We haven't landed on. It might be appropriate in some areas to have the RM1 as the first lot, depending on the nature of the area. So those are both options at this time that we have not decided.
Okay. 2.5 minutes. Thank you.
It would be similar to this, which is, it would be doing more of what the staff has been doing, which is, in this case, the 1 represents an RM1, the 2 represents the R4, and in some areas, it's only R4. So it's something very similar to that situation.
Okay, thank you. 3 minutes. Councilmember Cassar, and then back to Kathy.
And again, I want to emphasize that in my view, the term equitable means closer to the idea of just than the idea of it being exactly the same, understanding that each of our different districts has a different amount of land area, the percentage of transition area in our district versus the gross number versus where there's gentrification versus where there hasn't been. To me, just trying to say, hey, we need more similar levels of transition area per district doesn't, to me, equate to equity. And so I think I appreciate that the council's direction earlier this year was centered on equity, and that's what the staff is grappling with. And I look forward to, as we go through readings, to keep trying to make it more equitable. And that doesn't mean, to me, that we're going to keep trying to get the transition areas to look the same in each district, but more to try to get to the goals of making everybody's lives better.
Kathy, that was 3/4.
I have a question. I heard you mention an idea about the transit priority network and transit vehicles, identifying areas that are opportunities for transit vehicles to turn around. Is that something you've described somewhere in a document, or is that coming forward in your text later?
That was described in the Planning Commission recommendation. Is that correct? As they made their deliberations, and it's an idea that we potentially agree with, and so
Okay.
that's where it'll be
So
written
that's
down.
where-
You'll see it in
Thank
the
you.
report.
Okay. That was half a minute. Anything else on transition zone on this prompt before we move to the next prompt? Yes. Pio.
Yes. Can you explain to me how did y'all go around looking at historic districts, and like we have one, and I have one there in the Willow Street neighborhood up to Waller Street. It's a historic district where it's all these historic homes. How would R4 fit into one of those type of structures?
So, Councilmember Renteria, if a property has the H or HD in the zoning string, that was retained, but those properties were also mapped as part of the transition area criteria. So they're mapped, but any development would be subject to the limitations, the appropriate historic limitations.
Thank you.
Say that again. If it's in a historic district, the historic district trumps the transition zone issue?
Absolutely. If any development would have to comply with the applicable historic guidelines.
Okay. I know you've said that twice now in video, and I really appreciate you doing that. Can somebody send me a one-line email to council that says that? Just because I'm being asked to forward something that people can see that's in writing. So if you could write that down somewhere and give me a link to it, or send a one-line email to the council that says that, I think that would be helpful. Okay.
No.
Anything else before we go?
Just on the
Kathy?
LHD, I think it's very unclear how if multiple properties within an LHD are rezoned for much higher capacity, I think it's very unclear to people how those two things are in line. I mean, the reality is I think we will see people coming and asking for removal of H zoning, or, and I don't know how the staff are going to balance those requests. I mean, it's unclear to me how people make use of their entitlements if they're within an LHD, if their entitlements are, by the baseline 3 times what they are now. So I don't know that resolves the question for the constituents who are asking you and me and Pio, how those things mesh when you have very significant entitlements proposed for areas within a LHD.
I was in a conversation yesterday, that was, by the way, half a minute, in one of the neighborhoods yesterday, and if we can pass a rule, and then the rule applies. So even with a wide disparity, we would have a rule that is the rule. Your question is, would we compromise the rule if someone came in and asked for an exemption or something like that? I think people were surprised to learn of the council action that we took last week with respect to the slab issue that we took. I just mentioned that parenthetically. Leslie.
Just to follow up on that, Ann and I put some additional topics up on the message board that we want to have a discussion of, and so preservation, of course, is the incentives there is one of them, and as is the what was it? Then the bonus, also the historic preservation bonus, and I think Mary, you mentioned something about want to make sure that the preservation bonus is handled properly, so that it isn't seen as a loophole to get extra units, but they're not really extra units, so you can count the extra units. I just wanted to make sure that we also had a chance to note, which I guess we will at the end of our discussion today, about the other topics that we needed to note.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that these topics would happen, the discussion on the 3rd and maybe the 4th as a wrap-up for anything we don't get time to. So tax impact, which is the discussion with the Central Appraisal District parking. I think Ian mentioned the housing capacity rate was Kathy, and protest rights.
Okay. The next prompt we have was on residential multi-unit, mixed-use, Main Street, and other zones. Text or map, if anyone want to make a comment there. This was the third topic that I posted on the board, was residential multi-unit, mixed-use, Main Street, and other zones. If that serves as a prompt to anybody. Jimmy.
This is another kind of map artifact, and this might be happening in other districts where some properties that got zonings, what appears to be post-annexation, that got CS zonings because they needed to do they wanted to do a storage facility. And those got, in some places, really translated to MU5B in areas that I don't think we intend to have MU5B, because there's, again, no transit, there's no, it doesn't tick all the other boxes about where we're looking for intensity. So that's something that I've found in my district in certain areas where I think maybe MU3 would be more appropriate. Just thinking about where some of the zonings that we have, just because the code we have now is so broken that you had to really shoehorn certain things in. I don't know. I will get to this on process, but how staff wants us to kind of daylight map issues.
Now's a good time to do that. Thanks. So that was 1 minute. Anybody else who comment? Kathy, I think, was next. And Kathy, you're like at 14 and a half minutes, so you're over. So
Okay,
do it quick.
I'll be super quick. I would think we should consider setting minimum requirements for housing within the MU category so that we don't run into the same issue we did with VMU, where you can do a VMU project and not create any housing. And then within MS, I think we should consider doing the same thing and requiring housing be a component of that, though that would likely require creating a new commercial category, because there may be some commercial uses that aren't compatible with residential. But I think it would be of value, especially if we're making other changes and potentially reducing the capacity in other categories. I think we could pick up some additional capacity in both of those categories in ways that would be very compatible with the original Imagine Austin plan.
Which two zones were those? One more time. MS and...
Am I allowed to speak? MU and MS.
He's not looking.
MU would be set a minimum requirement for housing.
MU and
MS
MS.
would be potentially need to be split into MS and something else to capture the commercial zones that are compatible with residential and the commercial that we don't want to pair with residential.
See, that quarter minute got charged to you. The next prompt yes.
I've got just a quick one. I'm also curious in that conversation because I know sometimes you end up with multifamily, but you don't get like the little grocery stores underneath. And the more we can have that closer to where people are living in dense communities, I think the better. So I'm excited about that conversation.
Okay. Quarter. Jimmy.
Just one thing that we talked about on Thursday that several of us talked about is allowing more CUP uses. The zoning case we had where we had to shoehorn restaurant limited just to get a food truck on a property that is headed for RM. Maybe being more liberal with our CUP designations and uses so that it can be site to site in more of the RM and MU zones.
Okay. It's a quarter. Okay. Allison.
So I was out at the restroom for a second, but I think that Councilmember Tova brought up the issue of that we have areas that are currently zoned commercial only that now are being allowed residential, and they're not required to have affordability, which there was clear direction, and this is happening in MS and high opportunity areas particularly. So I want to make sure that we address that. And then I had, I'm not sure where to put this under the categories we have. So something that's of concern to me, and I believe that Councilmember Flanagan also had raised it in an earlier session, is that the current code has a development reserve category, and the new proposed code does not carry that forward. So there are properties that are zoned development reserve today that need some kind of new proposed zoning designation. In subdivisions where those are unbuildable areas, like green spaces owned by HOAs, they're currently zoned development reserve, but then they've now been given the zoning of the adjacent properties, but you can't build on them. And so I think it would be better to just be clear about what can be built there, because there can be confusion over time. So it seems like we might need some kind of zoning code for that kind of unbuildable space. The ones I'm familiar with are open space, but I don't know what else, and I'd be comfortable with them being zoned some kind of open space category or preserve or whatever's appropriate, but I think we need a new category for that.
We've been looking at perhaps using F25 and the DR development reserve for that, and that was input we've heard from meetings in your district as well, so we are considering keeping those DR.
So there's a difference in my mind between keeping something as F25 and calling something DR. And I think I would prefer it to be called DR and have a category that's DR, or it's DR, but, some of its conditions may be F25, but I think it would be somewhat clearer. I don't want to get rid of conditions if they have other conditions that I'm not
Sure.
aware of, but it seems like it's sort of a category that's different than F25 in some way.
Okay, it's 2 1/4. All right, so the next area that we had was affordability as a prompt. I'll repeat again what I've said earlier. There's a lot in this code. One, I think you did generally a really good job of carrying forward the intent and policy of maximizing opportunities for affordability. I remain real concerned about how fact-dependent these things are as they go through, and I would urge again that we have the expertise and dependent on staff to be able to calibrate correctly and to be able to adjust that yearly as the market changes. And I think we should be, and I support what Allison said in terms of if we're letting someone get residential in an otherwise commercial area, to take a look at that as an opportunity to be able to get affordability. For me, in part, it goes back to the calibration issue. If getting residential increases the value of the property, then there's value capture there that we ought to be able to then apply to affordability. But someone's going to need to take a look at and to confirm that once you get the residential use, it actually increases value. Because if it doesn't, then we're just setting ourselves up to a place where we'll never get the residential ability. So it has to be calibrated in a way, but always being mindful to get us affordability every place that it can calibrate and work that way, I think is an important thing. That was a minute. Greg?
I'm inclined for us to take existing VMU sites and to generally leave the affordability sections on those the same, so that we are better calibrating and coming up with solutions for the expanded affordability areas as opposed to the existing. It's not that we wouldn't change anything about existing VMU sites, but to essentially keep those affordability requirements and provisions intact, because we are so expanding the affordability bonus program, which I think has you guys coming to us saying we think we're increasing that capacity by 6 times the number of low-income units. I think that's great. And I think we should be focusing on continually calibrating the new things that we create rather than going and editing some of the existing programs. And I know it's not that simple, but if you all can think of how to make that sort of thing work, I think that would be helpful for folks, because now people are starting to look backwards and say, on this existing site, is it better? Is the affordability requirement better or worse than it used to be? And I think there's so much promise in the new stuff that if y'all can find a way to sort of leave that program more intact on existing sites and then use the expansion.
Ann?
I think you're talking about the same thing I was asking about. Because let me just double check. Because I'd heard that the VMU right now requires a minimum number, and that was one of the things that we lost in this. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, in some places, and I think that it makes sense to just leave that alone and better expand the affordability and leave those sites the way they are.
Okay, I would also look at the COs. There's a few places where we put COs in place to get affordability that didn't seem to carry over. So.
Okay. Anything else in the kind of affordability prompt here? Yes.
I'm not sure if this it goes in the code or not, but something that Councilmember Togo and I have been talking about is the creation of a fund to allow homeowners to access low-interest loans to build accessory dwelling units. Access to capital is a challenge for actually getting the ADUs, but I'm not sure if it goes in the code or somewhere else.
And to that end, we had talked at one point about having established ADU plans and things so that it was much easier for someone to be able to build ADUs. I think it might have been something that you brought way back when, 2 years ago. But to have standardized things so that someone could pretty summarily go through the administrative processes because plans had already been approved and the like. Yeah.
To that point, that might have more of a code impact. Are there things in the code that would make it easier for ADUs to be sold as separate properties, to be fee simple, to blah, 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 so that we might allow a substandard lot or some other type of lot to be carved out because that makes it easier for a real estate transaction that would help develop a capital market? That, I think, is more what I'm thinking about in terms of the code impact that would facilitate it.
Okay, it's a quarter. Yes, Mayor Protem.
You may be referring to the Homestead Initiative, which was kind of separate, but there is an organization, I believe, the Alley Flat Initiative does exactly that. They offer programs and free services for people, but the problem, even if you offer low interest loans, it's still a matter of the person's income, and like low interest loans can help if you qualify for a loan even to begin with, and so that I think that's the biggest hurdle. But I think it is an important, as one of our future topics, while it might not be directly related to land, to the code, people do have valid concerns about how they can maximize the benefits of their property and be able to stay there. And so I think we do need to have a discussion on what programs are available as we're moving this forward. Developers get, the evil developers, but they are the people that build houses. And so if we can somehow educate homeowners, and that kind of was the point of the homestead exemption, and we'll have to go back and see how we can talk about that again, because that was the idea, is how do we get homeowners educated to be able, maybe it's a home equity loan that they could qualify for to build something, and if they're not in that position, maybe it's subdividing the lot where they sell, a lot, and then we talk about, minimum lot sizes. But I think there are some valid concerns, and the more we can help homeowners realize that they can benefit from this and be able to stay in place, I think the easier we make this big change happen for Austinites.
It's 2 minutes. Pio and then Allison.
And there is a way for homeowners to do those kind of things, and it's through the state right now. It's they condo their property out. I have one friend that he was thinking about moving out, and I said, "Why don't you?" His dad had a lot on the corner, and he had the lot right next to it. And we had vacated the alley, so it was very easy for him to go ahead and build another unit in the back, sell the one in the front, and that's what he basically did. He sold it for $350,000, kept the backyard and built a house there, and just took the fence down between him and his dad. So there is opportunities out there, but I don't think we have that in the city yet, do we? Where you can condo your house out. If you can look into that.
I would just point out briefly that one of the Planning Commission recommendations was to look at utilizing a provision of state law that's intended to facilitate easier subdivisions for 6 or fewer lots, and we're going to work with the law department on exploring the possibility of that, and in certain circumstances, and as you noted, Councilmember Garza, that also implicates lot size in many contexts, so that would be something that we'd have to address as well. But we will be, in looking at the Planning Commission recommendation and preparing for first reading, that's something we'll be looking at.
Okay. Allison.
So no, when we were talking about Code Next, I was talking about the design templates and how that would facilitate things and having the smaller ADUs. I just want us to, make sure that as we're thinking about the code, we're thinking about who we're creating these incentives for. Developers build houses after they displace the occupants who live there. So we need programs that create opportunities for the existing occupants to build the ADUs or to take advantage of the ADU being built. And there's some of the things in the way that we have the current draft that really emphasize the developers as opposed to the person who lives in the house building the other thing. And obviously they have to have someone to build it, but in terms of who's being able to take advantage of it, there are different incentives that are being created by what we're doing than we seem to be talking about.
Do you have an example of that?
Sure. I mean, just as we were talking about, if I have a house and I want to preserve it and then I want to build, 2 units in back that could be these giant units. If I'm living in a 1,400 square foot house that I want to preserve, I'm not going to have the money, to do the other part in back, and I'm likely going to have to, sell the whole lot to the developer. So that would be one example, and then the access with the ADUs. It takes a lot of capital for the average person to be able to build that ADU, particularly when we have the large size ADUs. And generally the stuff on the RM4 and those people are not going to be able to build. If I'm in a 1,400 square foot house on an RM4 lot, I'm not going to be able to build a 10-unit building on it and stay in one of those apartments because I'm not going to be able to get the capital, to do that. So I will be displaced if I'm in that situation.
Okay. Yes.
I didn't know if you had another comment.
Oh, I feel like I have to push back against the developers build stuff after people are displaced, because there was just a zoning case in my district this last council meeting where nobody was even living there anymore. And there is, I guess, a developer that is wanting to build units there to create housing. As well as developers also help people build ADUs. So, the hyperbole is just a bit much sometimes.
Okay. Paige.
I know we had spoken a few months ago kind of about clarifying the process for ADUs, and I don't think there was an action item out of it, but I didn't know if you had a brief update or could give us a brief update at a future work session, kind of on the understanding of making it a little easier for a general resident of Austin that doesn't quite know the building process to be able to do something like an ADU, especially in a district like mine. It helps with aging in place, where people may be ready to downsize out of a larger home but still stay in their neighborhood and on their property. So I didn't know if that was in the works or if we just need to kind of pull that back up at a future time.
Councilmember Ellis, the Planning Commission's recommendation definitely speaks to the site plan process. This would be site plan exempt, but it also speaks to just generally facilitating permitting of missing middle housing. So that's definitely something we're going to look at. I don't know as that would entail any code changes. We've already tried to really streamline the universe of code requirements that these projects would have to meet, but I think at a minimum there can be a programmatic measure to address that and make it just as user-friendly and straightforward as possible.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Submitted. Jimmy.
I just wanted to reiterate what the Mayor Pro Tem said. I agree with that. sometimes developers are building a house because somebody got a job in another city, or some person passed away and the family doesn't want to keep the house. There's a lot of reasons why properties turn over, and it's important to keep that in mind. In fact, the more we allow people to maximize the use of their properties, the less pressure there will be on folks who don't want to redevelop, because the folks who are willing to sell, who don't want to live there, will sell cheaper than the ones who are fighting to stay in their homes. So there is a benefit to liberalizing the zoning, where folks, where you put that pressure where it can flow easiest. That's where capital will go. That's what we heard from the neighborhoods surrounding West Campus on Thursday, that increasing entitlement in West Campus relieved pressure they were experiencing in surrounding neighborhoods. So I think these are lessons that we can take elsewhere.
Okay, it's a minute.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I would just like to say that I didn't hear Councilmember Alter, and maybe it was just me, but I didn't hear her saying that in all cases developers built for that reason. And so I just want us to be careful to hear that perhaps people are just giving different perspectives, and that's not hyperbole. That's their perspective. So I didn't hear it that way. Maybe others did. I really just heard it as one perspective, and it is true in some circumstances that we do have, investors from other places investing, and that's just one piece. There's also the facts that you all said, Mayor Pro Tem, in terms of, people selling their houses. So all of those things can be true at the same time. So I just want us to hear people.
Thank you. Greg?
When we first edited the ADU ordinance, we did have recommendations to staff to come up with some of those templates, and I know it's things that has some existing work has been done on, and at some point we should close on that work. And I want to highlight Councilmember Flanagan's point from right before Councilmember Alter spoke, which is if there are opportunities where we can find where somebody has a very large lot and they may not have the capital to build an ADU, but would like to work with a company that can do so, and therefore make some of their asset liquid for them, that we should continue to look for opportunities for somebody to sell off a portion, or to shelve off a portion, or lease out a portion of their property, even if they don't have the capital up front. And I think that sounds like something everybody's interested in, that we'll keep working on, looking at.
Okay, that was 3/4. Thank you. I'm going to move now to the non-zoning. I will say, because this chart's up on the board and several people talked about it, we gave the instruction that said 2 to 5 lots, and with no greater description than that. And I see that what you were wrestling with in terms of the geographic difference, and I think that what you came up with was a very reasonable reaction to the overall intent to have a certain amount of area. So I think it's an important conversation for us to have. I'm most interested in seeing what Kathy raised, where she said, now that I've heard the explanation, I still have areas I don't understand. But in terms of the explanation that you gave to generally have that, I think for me, was an appropriate response.
Mayor Adler, the direction, just to be clear, the direction was generally 2 to 5 lots, and then further context sensitivity, and definitely staff viewed the 2 to 5 lots as more than just a criteria. They viewed it as sort of the starting point, and there were only certain circumstances where it was deemed appropriate to deviate from that. But it's definitely something, as Anik indicated, that we'll look at further in looking at criteria for the transition areas.
Sounds good. Let's talk about the non-zoning stuff in that area, Jimmy.
I have a few quick things. In the transportation chapter, where we're talking about trip counts, I would like to revisit what we learned during the River Place case, where we might want to allow a measured trip count for that site if it's different from the manual in terms of trip counts. I think there will be areas where trip counts will be higher than the manual. There will be areas where they're lower than the manual just because of walkability and transit. I think that would really speak to context sensitivity. I've had constituents submit draft language for that, but that would be something I'd like to look into. On another thing that Councilmember Kitchen and I talked about on Thursday about cost participation in transportation for land uses, that when they're putting in money, I think this might be solved by some of the impact fee stuff that we're doing, but that the city could be cost participating, but not waiting for a project to be fully funded before we built it and then reimbursing the city from the fees from the next 3 or 4 projects. I'm not sure if that's in this or if that's separate to the impact fee system, but that's something that I'm interested in. That way we can get the roads built and still have the next 2 or 3 developments pay for it and not be exempted from it. In the infrastructure chapter, I'm curious why we penalize wastewater infrastructure in the drinking water protection zone, because it seems to incentivize septic systems and field distribution when we don't allow cost participation or payment plans for wastewater like is allowed everywhere outside of a critical drinking water zone. It seems like that's where we would want formal wastewater infrastructure as opposed to other ways. Also in that chapter, I'm curious if we've thought about allowing ADUs or cottage courts or even townhomes or single family attached to share a water tap. If there are reasons why we won't allow that, it would be good to know. I've certainly met constituents who want to convert a garage on the backside of their property, but the tap fee is the thing that's stopping them from doing it. And so it'd be interesting to know if we can get that section to allow a single tap to serve 2 units on the same property, for example. And then this is small, but 239C 4070, we talk about impact fee exemptions for certain affordable housing. In C3, it says newly constructed single-family home or multifamily housing unit. And I'm worried that that's going to conflict with how we've defined different types of housing elsewhere in the code. So should we be allowing that? Does that include duplexes? Does that include ADUs? Is an ADU a single-family home? I don't know that it is based on where we've defined it elsewhere. Those are my notes.
That was 2 3/4 minutes. I still don't, I'm not clear on the modeling that was done with respect to the corridors, because I'm hearing different things in the community about whether or not we're able to achieve the density and the residential supply and the like on corridors. And I think that's real important. I mean, it's one thing that we have all agreed on as a group in terms of being a real high priority. We need to be able to realize that. But I hear different things about the modeling that have gone on, so I'd like to have a better feel for what the modeling showed. I want to make sure that we can, and I think the priority was set in the council to make sure that we're able to achieve that on our corridors. And I don't know if the concerns are valid. I'd like to know that we're not achieving them. If they are valid, I want to know how we're doing then to adjust them. I hear parks in that context. So I need to better understand if there's an issue there or not that needs to be resolved. Obviously, we just adopted the parks plan. It's important for us to have park acreage. I don't know if there's a trade-off there that we tweak the levers to get greater park some other way or in some other place so that we still achieve the same kind of park standards in the city, both geographically and totally, but still allow the corridors to develop. So I'm interested in better understanding what the modeling shows or not show that's significant. And to that end, I hear questions about what's in the code versus what's in the criteria manual. I think that one of the things that we're trying to achieve here is some measure of predictability with respect to what can be built or how things are going to apply, so that when someone's looking at a piece of property, they know what they can, generally know what they're going to be able to do on it without having to enter into a city process to determine what it is that they can do on it. Generally speaking, on the criteria manual, I think that there's a lot of kind of angst in the community on all sides as to what it's going to show or not show. And I wonder if, rather than trying to resolve all of those questions in this form and in this way, whether it makes sense for us to say that the initial adoption of the criteria manual comes to the council, and then thereafter it can be amended, but so as to provide that place for people to know that there's going to be a place to have that discussion, so that the code itself and the mapping the code can move forward, knowing that at least the initial adoption of the criteria matter comes back to the council. But I'm real concerned about development of the corridors, and that was 3 minutes. You all want to comment on that?
Yes, Mayor, just with respect to the criteria manuals, if council gives that direction with respect to council approval, we can certainly work with the law department. As a general matter, the criteria manuals are administrative rules, and so they are on the manager's side of the line. However, I do want to point out to your comment about the need for a public process and the need for predictability. The council did, or the Planning Commission did in its recommendation suggest that there be a public hearing before the criteria manuals are adopted, and so that would be, and again, we'll work with the law department on exploring that, but that would be a process above and beyond just the stakeholder review process that occurs for the adoption of administrative rules. And so that would provide, while it wouldn't provide an approval by the commission, it would provide a more robust opportunity for engagement and for a public hearing.
Okay. And I would just like that explored. I wasn't picking one solution over the other. I just think that we're going to be able to better facilitate the adoption of this code if there's a way for us to better address the concern about the criteria manual. All right, that went up to 4.25 minutes. In this area here, the prompt is non-zoning, so drainage, water quality, transportation, tree protection, parkland signs. Paige.
It's the good stuff. Can you talk a little bit about drainage and water quality? I know there's some places that may see, small amounts of accumulation of water that, they're worried about additional units equating to flooding, and kind of how our better practices can avoid that.
Thank you, Councilmember. Matt Holland with Watershed Protection, and that's definitely an issue we've been looking at very closely as we monitor your council guidance to limit impervious cover to existing levels of entitlement. And we've also, as you guys already know, we're looking closely at these new plumbing code options to avoid lot-to-lot flooding problems. Mm-hmm. We did announce to the Planning Commission that we're going to take another look at the transition area impervious cover. We know that's been a very strong community interest. Our early out analysis shows that there are very few areas that are going up very much in terms of impervious cover entitlement, but we're going to take a second look and look at those few areas that do look like they're going up more than just just a couple of % of entitlements. So, and I'm happy to elaborate more if you have additional detailed questions.
Yeah, just maybe offline we'll get together and kind of look at kind of neighborhood by neighborhood and understand how that relationship plays out better.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. I guess I'm going to switch topics a little bit. I'm interested in the idea of a heritage tree preservation bonus of some sort. Is there discussion of if you're making adjustments to your site plan to avoid your impacts to heritage trees? Are they allowed to build a little taller to kind of help keep them in that same square footage allowance? Or is there any attention being paid to that at this time?
To my knowledge, I think the one area where that's addressed is the Board of Adjustment has been given clearer criteria to consider tree preservation in granting zoning variances, but as far as any sort of administrative bonus based on tree preservation, I don't believe there is one. There definitely is where trees are on public property or in easements, there's a greater ability to consider, I think, transportation impacts, because there definitely have been sometimes trees, there are issues with regard to driveway placement and access, but in general, I don't think there's anything that quite speaks to what you're describing, Councilmember Ellis. And Matt, do you have any other comments?
Not at this time.
Okay. I'm just interested in that.
That's something certainly, though, we can look at. There certainly definitely are, there are things that we could consider that would get to that for sure.
Yeah, I think it could help make sure that we're able to keep as many trees as possible and still provide the housing space. So I'm kind of interested in how we might be able to blend those together. And then I've been talking with my own staff a bit about parkland dedication and kind of the ability, who gets to decide at which acreage, whether people are paying fee in lieu or if they're providing that space on site directly. And so I just wanted to kind of, hello. I just wanted to maybe have a chance to kind of talk about that and see what might be in the works, if there's any updates to the way we're currently doing it, and who gets to decide whether it's on-site or fee in lieu payments that are made.
Thank you. Scott Grantham, Parks and Recreation Department. There are, in terms of the decision-making, it is an administrative decision of check whether it be fee in lieu or actual land dedication. Okay. There's also an option sometimes of off-site dedication, and that's something that we also can apply our criteria to see if there's an area within a quarter mile that would meet parkland criteria. We are going off of previous council direction, which says that all citizens of Austin should be within either a quarter mile or half mile walk of a park. And just to get the last part of your question, that there have been minimal changes from the previous parkland dedication ordinance, which was passed in 2016, and the current draft of the LDC.
Okay, I appreciate that information, and I think it may be advantageous as we look at our, trails planning and, other things we're working on in the city to kind of make sure we're closing those gaps where we can. If it's helpful to have it on site, or if it's helpful to have them provide that missing piece of a puzzle and some trail network that's very close by, I think that could be an opportunity that we have here.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. That was 4 minutes. And to that end, on the park, I mean, the issue that I just had with it, I just want to know how that relates to the testing that was done to make sure that what we're doing with parks and with what we adopted in 2016 isn't impacting what can be developed on the property in terms of realizing the densities and the housing supply questions that we had. Recognizing that our instruction was, if you have to compromise that in that area, find another way to compensate for it, then I'd be interested in knowing how else we're going to compensate for it in order so that every one of those is not a negotiation between our Parks Department and people that are trying to work on property.
Thank you, Mayor. We, as insofar as possible, we try to make it a very transparent process, and so we have criteria that are part of the code. We also have a parkland deficiency map, which is public, and which anybody can go and look at. And those are some of the criteria. One thing I'd like to specifically address is the size of the parcel. And when you're thinking about some of these urban areas where with smaller lots, typically we wouldn't look at parkland dedication on site for any lot that is under 1.66 acres. The reason for that is that per those lots would generate a park that would be smaller than a quarter acre, and a quarter acre is really the minimum that we would like to accept as part of the Parks Department.
So does our code say now that there is no dedication on a lot smaller than 1.66?
It doesn't specifically say that, but it does say that the land must meet criteria, and so that is in one of our manuals.
Okay. So maybe there's a way for us then, if that becomes an issue, to actually put it in the code so that people know that it would be applied that way. And I don't know that 1.66 is right. I don't know what the right number is relative to the goals that we had with respect to what we wanted to be able to achieve on that property in terms of density and the like. So I'm just raising that issue and I think it goes back to the testing issue. We just need to find out whether there's an issue here or not, and if there is, then how we address it.
Yes, Mayor, and I would also add one thing, which is that the 1.66 wouldn't be an absolute, because in some instances there is either a critical connection which we're looking for, which could be a piece of a green belt we're trying to acquire, or perhaps a way for a multifamily complex to reach an existing park. So it's just one of the criteria that we look at. It's not the only one.
And what I'm trying to do is try to get to it and put that in so that when someone's looking at a piece of property and they know that if they have that critical connection, they're going to be asked to give it. If they don't have the critical connection, they know that it's just not, that kind of discretionary thing just isn't going to come up. Just so that someone can look at a piece of property without having to engage our staff and have a really good idea of what it is that they can do.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Jimmy.
I just want to reiterate what Councilmember Ellis said. I have the same thoughts about parkland dedication and kind of thinking about it in that way. And thank you, Mayor, for going a little bigger on that. On signs, my understanding is there's some changes made. I don't know that I am wanting to contemplate sign regulation changes in the middle of this process. I feel like it's a different conversation with the community, with a different set of stakeholders, and I would prefer not to make changes to the sign regulation in this process, but doing sign regs in a parallel process to this.
Okay.
If I can just briefly address signs. So there's, I think, kind of two aspects to the sign regulations as part of this process. One is just the basic revised sign code chapter, and that is an inevitable part of this process. Our existing sign code chapter is written, with zoning districts that would change based on the adoption of the new code. And so it will be imperative that some revisions to the sign code occur. The basic draft that was provided on October 4th is consistent generally with draft 3. There are a few procedural enhancements, but it is not, other than the removal of the relocation provisions for off-premise signs, it is not worlds apart from the current code. It's I think clearer. It includes greater use of pictures. It's kind of more tightly written than our current code, but it's not substantially different other than the issue that I mentioned with regard to relocating billboards. Subsequent to the October 4th draft, staff in planning and zoning and the law department came forward with an appendix to our staff report from October 25th that includes some amendments that would provide new opportunities for off-premise advertising that are consistent with a council initiation from last year. And so that's kind of a separate item from just the base draft of the sign chapter, and that would be sort of a further refinement and revision to the draft sign chapter that was provided with the October 4th draft.
So it's not clear to me, based on what you said, if the sign chapter in this draft is similar to draft 3 or similar to current code. Because I heard you kind of say both.
It's similar to draft 3, but draft 3 is not that far apart from current code. It's clarified, it's refined, I think it's tightened up.
Okay.
But the one exception to that is that both draft 3 and then this draft as well removes the relocation provisions for off-premise billboards.
Well, I don't know how others feel. I don't know that I'm going to be ready in the same timeline as I am on other chapters for first reading. For signs, I might want to come back at second and third with better thoughts on the sign chapter, because I've spent my time really thinking about the other ones because they all fit together in a very specific way, but the sign chapter doesn't necessarily fit together in that same way. And so if we, it sounds like no matter what, we're going to have to look through it at least once to make sure that the zones are translated correctly and other things. But I might want to be able to reserve comments on sign regs until February.
For draft 3, we did prepare an overview document that was kind of like a staff report specific to signs, just to kind of give people an idea of the changes that are occurring from current code. And we can certainly update that if you all would like an overview of the sign chapter.
Okay, thank you. Allison.
Thank you. I was actually very pleased that we kept the parkland dedication as is in this draft. I think it's a really important, as we grow as a city, that we have an opportunity to increase our parkland or increase our funding for our parks. And Having worked on that ordinance, it kicks in when you really need the parkland the most, and we really need to keep that in mind. It also has a lot of things built in that protect for some of the situations that we've been talking about. And just one of those that I wanted to highlight right now, since it hasn't been mentioned yet, is that you can go in and you can get a binding statement, I believe it is, a year out as to whether you'd be required to have parkland or not. And then obviously if you, after that point, came up with an option that was very close by or off that, or a connection that they hadn't anticipated, that would be something you could still be having the conversations about. But that is something that is built in, and many folks have taken advantage of it. And so you have quite a bit of certainty up front about what you're required. We know which areas are parkland deficient. We know which ones are in the urban core and which are not. And so it's pretty easy to calculate. It's a formula. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. What is uncertain is when you can get it waived, not when you are required to do it. And then you would have to engage in those conversations and find solutions. And there's flexibility built in, I believe, to do that. I wanted to just flag that I'm not ready to talk about them today, but I'm going to want to dive into the administrative procedures at some point. I haven't really been able to do that yet, so I'm not sure what's in there at the moment. I wanted to talk about a particular issue that some of us are experiencing in our districts, where we have proven localized flooding that have been seeing some big upzoning, and so we'd be putting more units in areas that we already know flood, and that is problematic. And I'm not sure that I understand the logic, but I don't know if we have time to go into that here. But I really like to see us consider prohibiting impervious cover increases in those areas that are identified with local area flooding. And I want to request that staff examine those areas that have documented localized flooding and determine how housing capacity would be impacted if we had equivalent existing impervious cover entitlements maintained in those areas. We just passed Atlas 14, and we didn't allow you to have any more units in a flooded area without making certain steps, et cetera. I don't quite understand why we're adding some very considerable density into areas that have localized flooding, which is not providing, it just seems to be exacerbating the problem as I understand it.
Again, the data we have showing now, most of those areas go up very minimally, if at all. However, there are some that do go up, and we want to take a really deep dive into that, and we'll have more specifics in the future for the council.
Thank you. I would really appreciate that, because some of these neighborhoods have really been trying to work closely on the localized flooding and to get solutions, and there don't seem to be any solutions, and so kind of adding more density in an area where we have no solution and adding the density is not going to help any seems kind of counter to what we're trying to achieve.
We definitely hear you loud and clearly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's 3 3/4. The last section that you could segue into it was the process. Site plan, subdivisions, variances, appeal process. Does anybody want to weigh in on this area? I'm still working on it. Anything else? All right, I think those were all the prompts we had. Before we get into the process for first reading, before we get to that, does anybody else want to raise anything else on this issue? Ann, go ahead.
I didn't understand your question. I don't now. I just wanted to put a marker and,
That's fine.
and subjects for next time. So
You can do that. You want to put a marker in for
Well, just Councilmember Poole had already raised them, and we put them on the message board. I don't have the list in front of me. But we
Okay.
had proposed some additional topics
Okay.
to take up on December 4th, I think it is, and then use December 5th it is for anything that people still want to get to.
Then we got the 3rd and 4th, and then
sorry,
we have
3rd
the
and
public
4th.
hearing. Then we have the public hearing then on the 7th. And I hope that everybody's going to make real liberal use of the message board with respect to posting ideas that people should think about, but also getting on there and commenting on people's things so that we might be able to advance some things before the 3rd and 4th in terms of what people are thinking or whatever. I think that would be really helpful as we get into that. Yeah, Paige?
I just generally wanted to thank staff. I know y'all have been working really hard on this for a long time. And because things like this are so difficult to update, this code's from 1984, we need to anticipate this code is going to last maybe another 35 years, maybe longer. So I would hope that we can find a way to build in some triggers to kind of make sure that it flows as our city grows too. I don't quite know what that looks like yet. I'm still kind of thinking about it, but I just think whatever we can do to kind of make sure it's flexible enough to grow with our city over the next few decades, the better off we'll all be. We'll know the expectations of building, and there will be fewer surprises for people. If we're trying to do this every 35 years, it could be really cumbersome.
All right, so let's talk then about...
What Councilmember Kitchen and Councilmember Poole raised, I like the categories as the Planning Commission used, and then I think generally as you used them, they seem almost the same. If I could mention to Councilmember Kitchen and then maybe Councilmember Poole's staff or whoever is watching, of the things that y'all listed on the message board, it seems many of them fit into these categories, but some don't. I think in particular the tax issue doesn't. I think the protest issue is a process issue around when do things go into effect, because I think there's lots of questions about, on the Code Next process, we were thinking about how many months it would take before something went into effect with the process of things going in. But it seems like the tax one doesn't fit under those 6 categories, but the other ones do, because for me, parking as an issue in and of itself, I'm more interested, if we could talk about what people's concerns or questions might be about parking in residential zones versus on a corridor zone, that's, to me, it's more useful to break it down still into these sort of 6 categories as opposed to talking about parking entirely separate from which area we're talking about it in. So if we could, I would like to discuss parking, but if we could actually discuss it, figure out which areas it relates to of these categories we went through today and the Planning Commission went through, I think it's easier to keep track of.
Yeah.
I don't have a thought on how it's categorized. I wasn't thinking that. So did I understand correctly that we're trying to organize things around the 6 categories that were presented this morning? Is that what you're saying?
If possible, it sounds.
Okay.
I do think that taxes don't fit into that.
And really, I just pulled that because that's how the Planning Commission did it, and I just thought that
It was useful for organizing my thoughts coming up to today, and so and I think corridors is one of them, and y'all have capacity on corridors being one of them. The capacity analysis and exactly how that works might fit outside of the code itself. So I imagine if we want to go over capacity analysis like y'all raised today and taxes, to me those don't fit into the 6 categories that we went over today because that's not in the code as much.
But you're not suggesting we don't talk about them.
Oh, no, I would like to talk about all of the things that you raised. I'm just saying that when we have specific amendments to the code, I think these categories seem to actually be pretty useful. But then there's some things that don't exactly fit in the code, like taxes or how did the staff do their capacity analysis. That might have to be a separate section.
That's fine. You're just talking about how we think
how
about
we organize it. But no, I think it'd be great to talk about each of the things.
I'm fine with that. So.
And then a historic preservation bonus, do you mean that is different than the preservation? You do mean that is different than the preservation incentive?
The preservation incentive is more the thinking around the McMansion concept or concern. And the other issue relates to actual preservation for historic properties.
Got it.
Okay. So let's have a conversation about what's coming down next. Allison, before we get into that topic, did you want to say something?
Yes. I wanted to just flag a couple of things that I know that Councilmember Poole wanted to mention, and then I want to talk about our post. So she is likely interested in reserving impervious cover increases in R4 and RM1 for on-site affordability. So that'll be something that she'll want to talk about. And then she had some specific ideas to leverage tree preservation that she'll probably want to talk with you about as well. I don't know all of the nuances. And then I just wanted to flag for my colleagues that the mayor and I posted just before we started today a message to the message board. I don't want to go into detail of it now. I just wanted to flag it for you. And since I had copies, I'm going to pass it out. These are some areas that we've talked about already today. today, but that we want to have an opportunity to have staff look at. I think that on many of these, there's large agreement, but we thought it would be helpful to pull them together into one place. And just to kind of be able to illustrate some of the things that we were thinking about in that regard.
Okay, thanks. All right, with respect to where we go, so we're done this today. You guys are going to come out on the 25th with additional information. We have a work session on 2 days, the 3rd and the 4th, I think. And then we have a public hearing on the 7th. And then we meet for first reading on the 9th. I think we're setting a hearing for the 9th and also for the 11th. Hopefully we'll get the 10th off. I guess it's conceivable that we could carry over from the day before. But, you know, if everybody could keep that in mind. What I had suggested and proposed was the posting that went up on the board about a month ago, and it was generally recommending that we stay at a pretty high level when we do the first reading, that we're not making individual map changes at that point, or my suggestion would be we're not making interlineations in the code itself, but we keep it at a pretty high level. Kind of the kind of conversation that we're having here today, and the kind of conversation that we had back in April. The ability to be able to say to the council, we don't think you hit this direction right, or we now that we've seen these things, we want to change the direction that we gave. But we try as best we can to keep things at a pretty high level. So that was my suggestion for how we approach this. Yeah.
I think I passed out a document that tries to just give us something to talk from, in terms of approach, and I think it is consistent with what the mayor posted, and it was my intent was to be consistent with what the mayor posted in terms of a process. So I'd like to just walk through it real quickly. So the thinking is that on this, I've got the wrong date. It's the 9th, not the whatever the date is that is the day that we pass that we.
It's the 9th.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
It's okay.
So that we pass on first reading the staff's revised proposed approach, understanding that some of us may have caveats like Councilmember Flanagan raised earlier about the sign portion. But anyway, the point being is that our goal is to pass on first reading on that day. But then I wanted to suggest that we each of us may have areas that, while we want to move the ball forward and pass on first reading, we may have areas that we still have some questions about. So I wanted to suggest an approach to actually get at those questions that is something that narrows us down from the kind of questioning that we're doing right now. So my thought there was to do something similar to what we do in the budget process, and that's why I called this direction. So I might say, for example, that I want to vote to move forward on first reading. I have questions about this one area, for example, and I'd like to ask staff to come back to me with certain changes or options that might address that area. So that's what I mean by direction. I would think that we would want to make sure that our direction stays within the scope of our policy direction that we adopted in May. And so I would be thinking that we might be thinking of direction that addresses policy matters that were not addressed in the code, or perhaps they're policy matters that any one council member may think were not interpreted within the meaning of the code, or perhaps they're ones where we have questions about whether we're actually achieving what we all thought we were trying to achieve in the code. And I gave an example here, which may not be relevant anymore because we seem to be moving forward on this issue, but to my mind, I was thinking that it would be direction like direct city manager to propose additional options for achieving more affordable units along corridors to include options for maintaining VMU standards for minimum affordable units and options for accepting voluntary contributions of affordable housing units. I put this here just as an example of what I mean by direction. Maybe request is a better word than direction. But basically what I'm trying to do is say that narrow us down as a council to pass on first reading and then be clear on the additional things to the extent that we can that we want to ask for options on. And that's what I mean by directions. So that's my thought. And then with regard to the mapping, again, it's December 9th, not the 7th, that we would not be addressing the mapping on the 9th. But we do need to understand what our process is for that. So I was going to propose that we as council members submit our map changes by a deadline, whatever deadline we want to set. What has been happening so far is our various folks in the community or in our districts have submitted their thoughts to staff, and staff has bundled those up and sent them to us, and then I think sending everybody a memo about them. So my question is, well, okay, so what do we do with that? So my thought is that as council members, we submit our map changes by a certain deadline. And then I would hope that we could handle mapping on consent, just like we do consent right now, and we'd be presented with a total map. But just like we do with consent right now, individual council members could pull parcels off the consent map, keeping in mind our goals for the capacity, which is what we're trying to get at as an overall. And I would hope that we would have a minimum of pulling items off of consent of the map. I'm hoping that what we can get to is a place where we can all adopt a map on consent. And then we would pass that in February. So that's my, just a straw man for us to talk from. It helps me to put some more specifics to it, and that's why I wanted to put it on paper.
Okay.
So, thoughts?
Mayor Pro Tem.
So I guess my thoughts on the direction and no votes taken, I feel like what the mayor proposed on the message board was trying to keep this first reading as clean as possible. And the all direction will be adopted. I don't know what happens when there's a difference in we just had a difference of opinion in the interpretation of hyperbole. So, what happens when there's a difference of opinion in how something is interpreted or not? And so, in my mind, if there is direction given, I think there should be votes taken.
Well, could
because
I
it
please wait. Let's give other people a chance to talk.
I was just going to
No,
answer
but
a
you're not going
question.
to talk every other time, and everyone's going to be talking about this.
I guess generally this just feels like another concept list, and we've learned from that.
That's not what I meant. When I
Allison.
get a chance, I'll explain.
You'll get a chance. Allison.
I just wanted to point out again that we have a Campo meeting on the 9th night. So as we're factoring how long this is going to be and what's going to take place in our timing, we need to be over at the Thompson Center at 6 for that.
And we're also taking a look at the Campo agenda to see what it is that we have to do and whether there are action items or what action items would be up that night. Hopefully we'll make that determination here real quickly so everybody knows that.
Thank you.
Leslie.
So I had to step out for the press conference, and I'm trying to catch up. Are we only talking about the night?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Based on what Ian was saying and then what Delia was saying about direction, I think the fact is that there may be some areas where we are not in agreement, and we need to have that highlighted so that we can have the discussion about where we may or may not agree and how wide is that gap. So to the extent that we may have conflicting direction, I think we already have some in even from the guidance document from May. I don't see that as an estoppel of that process. I think we actually embrace that and move forward with it and talk about the things that we around the dais may have differing interpretations and agreements on. So then we can kind of lay it out. And again, my goal in the end, as I've been saying numerous times, is folks in our citizens, the residents, the public, our communities need to know what it is we're doing, and they have to have an idea about what we think we're doing and how it affects them, because we want them to support what we're doing, because our job here is to represent them. And I think we do that through the way Ann is describing it, where we have direction to the extent that it may be countermanded by somebody else's direction. That's okay. Hope there aren't too many of those instances, but I expect there will be some. But then we need to have those, we need to discuss them and come to some kind of an agreement on, even if it's a hard vote. And some of us are in a minority. I'm certainly have a lot of experience with that in this process, being in the minority on the votes. So that's fine with me.
Yeah. Jimmy?
So I agree with Mayor Pro Tem. I think I heard Councilmember Kitchen say maybe she was talking about requests and not direction. So there may be the types of things where we're just all acknowledging, sure, staff can go out and answer those questions. But I think there are going to be places where there will be disagreement on how much staff resource we want to apply to fleshing out different options. So I'm not going to be comfortable with a process that doesn't allow the council to deliberate and decide and choose. I feel like our direction earlier this year was that process. As others have noted, there is conflicting stuff in that direction. Staff has come with their best opportunity and their best analysis of how to split those differences, and I wouldn't want to add more conflicting direction or conflicting requests to the process. It's time to take the votes.
Greg, and then Paige.
I generally, I feel comfortable with the way the mayor has had this laid out on the message board for some time, because I do think it's important for us to vote on things for this, to bless changes the staff has recommended, to pass more significant high-level changes for the staff to work on in the map and text over the period between December and February, so that folks don't continue sometimes sending us, if we have a sense of where we're going, I don't want community members to have to send in comments about the October draft if in December the council can move forward on a first reading draft that incorporates community feedback and council feedback on that first draft. I don't read what Councilmember Kitchen has laid out here as saying we're not going to do that, but I feel very comfortable with what the mayor has put forward. And then as it comes to staff time, if these sorts of directions that ask for staff time to sort of flesh out ideas or options could also be posted in time for that posting deadline of December 5th, we may find that some of those questions may not take up that much staff time, and I'd be fine with having those requests go in. But if it seems like there's a really long list of a lot of staff to investigate a lot of stuff, then I would really want to hear from the staff and from the dais about, and I'm not implying that it's going to go one way or the other, but I just don't, all requests immediately being incorporated and staff being asked to do all of those things. I don't know if that's a short list or a long list, and I don't know what those requests are. So upon reading this upon the first time, I would just want, I think that if those things are also posted, that council can decide those, and I would be inclined to have some amount of exploration of new ideas, but I think most of what the staff and council need to do are decide the hard questions, take some votes, not do the really technical stuff, remapping this specific parcel, that specific parcel in December, but instead doing the sort of bigger ideas, the kinds of things that you all laid out in this presentation, I think is what we need to decide on first reading.
Paige?
I agree with that. And I also am a little worried, just because if we're adding additional direction in, we already gave the city manager a 20-page document, and I would worry that additional direction might conflict with that. And I think staff's been very diligent with saying, we are going to get through first reading, we're going to take our list of to-dos back, and we're going to go work on them over the winter break, and I worry about staff time during those weeks, incorporating more work that may ultimately conflict with what was council approved. So I kind of want to be protective of what has been approved and what the direction has been for months. And I'm just worried about, if we all agree on what should be answered or what should be looked at, then that's one thing. But if it's just everyone throw your ideas in the hat and see what comes out, that really worries me about this process. So I feel like we're on the right track. And I just want to be very guarded about what has been approved council approval moving forward.
And
Well, okay, I understand what people are saying. It's a matter of degree, and you can't really get that until you see what those requests are. And I should have used the word requests because that's really what I meant. So, so perhaps what we can do is ask that them be posted on the message board and people can take a look at them, because what I have in my mind actually aligns with what everyone is saying. Because when I'm talking about requests, what I'm really trying to say is that within the parameters of the document we already made decisions on, but within those parameters, there's still some question marks, and I want us to be open as a council to thinking about a range of options that might still get us what our goal is. And if we just shut that process down and say, I don't even want to hear any other options, then we may have some better options to actually get us there. So what I'd like to suggest is, well, let's just post things on the message board. Let's think about them as requests. Because the bigger picture that I'm trying to get at is I want us to still have the opportunity to think together and to brainstorm together within parameters about how we're going to get to a result. So, and I don't want us to shut each other down if we're going to ask the staff to address something that could get us there. And then I want to give some guidance to the staff, because, I mean, I could just ask questions outside of this process, but then that's even a bigger range for the staff to have to deal with, as opposed to a smaller group of things. So that's what I'm trying to get at here. I want to give an example that perhaps so that I can understand what everybody is thinking. So earlier there was this, Mayor, I think you raised the question that someone had made a suggestion to you that what would it look like if we did R3 everywhere? And there was someone else that said they thought that might be a good thing to think about. And then I think Mayor Pro Tem, you suggested that we shouldn't go down that road because we've already decided a different way. So so what do we do in that kind of scenario where someone has raised an option? Some of us think it might be an option worth exploring. Others of us think it's not. So do we get to explore that option or not? That's really what I'm trying to get at. Maybe that's not the best example, because maybe that's one that, after a little thinking, we all agree it's not one to go forward with. But if there is something that some of us think is an option that's worth asking a question about within the parameters of what we already decided, within the goals that we already set, I think that we would have a stronger code and a stronger ability to work together with the community if we allow those options to be considered. So that's all I'm trying to get at.
so I think a lot of this, is consistent with kind of what I had in my head in writing this down, because I think people should be able to develop concepts. My recommendation would be that we pass on first reading in December, both the map and the plan. I would pass them both on first reading so that they both move forward. That said, I like the idea of requests that people have so that they can develop ideas. I think it does go to the issue of we don't really know what that's going to look like till we get there, and one of the chief things I think we can do is to be narrowing down the issues and to give the community kind of direction as to where we are. And I think that the best way to do that would be to have us we could conceivably do two different things. We could be passing the code as recommended by staff with what the staff changes were that would be coming in. And as part of the November 25th work or those kinds of things. We also pass, if we need to, direction that would reflect the sentiment of the council, but that we give people the opportunity to be able to make requests for things that they want to be able to otherwise develop, so that they can bring back on second reading to be able to make a case for something else. I'd also suggest that we have a lot of time between now and December 9th, and the more people can go on the message board between now and December 9th and say, I'm interested in this kind of request being made, and it's a little bit different, or it's a different way of looking at stuff. I think that if we make real good use of the message board, that would be a real efficient way to be able to do that. I'm not sure about adopting kind of the elements of this, because I'm not sure how they would be applied. Obviously, when we're doing mapping, we'll be taking into account district unit capacity. We'll also be taking into account city capacity. We'll be taking into account ASMP, the points that the Mayor Pro Tem made earlier with respect to not just having capacity, but having capacity in the right places. I mean, all those things get considered as part of the universe. But what I would recommend is that we stay close to what I had proposed with further kind of description for what Ann had. I would have us passing on first reading both the map and the plan. I would have us giving direction both to the plan and direction to the map. But the map direction would be at a high level. It wouldn't be parcel-specific direction on the map. It would be broader kinds of things that translate in larger geographic areas or across the city. But that the individual map changes, I think we need to be teeing up as early as council members know in December and in January to start saying, hey, there's some areas in my district that I know about that this didn't pick up the context sensitivity that I think that it should. Again, getting those things as elevated as best we could. Mayor Pro Tem.
I mean, you know, it's all about interpretation, and I know, Councilor Kitchen, you said maybe this isn't the best example, but that's the exact example that I'm worried about, that I think Councilmember Ellis is talking about, like just throwing stuff, new ideas out there, when that one in particular, I'm looking back at the policy direction, and the very first line talks about a development pattern that supports a 50-50 transportation mode share by 2039. And I think we could all agree that just rezoning everything R3 is not aligned with the very first line in our policy direction. And so, I feel like this feels very similar to the same difficulties we have when it came to the budget, is reopening something that doesn't need to. I agree that we need to have important conversations and vet, different ideas, but I don't know if first reading is, maybe it's we pass, what's proposed so far and then have those discussions, and we each have the ability to ask staff. You suggested maybe I can just ask a bunch of questions, and we can do that now. Every single one of us, it's my understanding, can ask staff any question. It might take them time to give us answers for all kinds of different scenarios, but the whole purpose of this policy direction was to create some kind of box, and I agree that there is a lack of, unity on how we interpret it, but if we're going to change, or if we're going to start talking about interpretations, I do think there needs to be, votes taken on that, because, anyway. That's it.
Theo?
Yes, Mayor, I agree with you. I would feel a lot more comfortable if we took the first reading, including the maps. I think constituents in my district really want to know what direction we're going to go, and only way that they're going to be able to see that is by taking that first reading.
Okay, and providing the direction. Allison.
So I'm fairly uncomfortable deciding what kind of process I want on December 9th when I haven't seen the Planning Commission overview. I don't know what's in there. I don't know what staff's recommendations are. I don't know what staff is going to come out with on the 25th. I'm heartened by hearing the presentation today that they have heard the community and they're making some important changes. But in the absence of knowing what is, I don't have a full overview of what the Planning Commission said. We have one slide that tells us what the Planning Commission did. They spent 8 meetings on it and had, I don't know how many votes. So I just want to, I'm willing to have the mayor's as a straw man with some additions from Ann right now, but I don't really know what I'm voting on at the moment. So it's kind of difficult to say this is the best process moving forward.
Okay.
And I also want to add that some of us have asked questions and we still don't have answers to our questions. And that is a source of frustration because we don't know if the answers of our questions will be revelatory in terms of next steps or not. And it is important that those questions get answered. Many of them are not difficult questions. I know that they've been very busy, but if we can't get our questions answered through the mechanism that we are supposed to, that is problematic for us moving forward.
Okay. Ann?
I have a question about the mapping. So I have a question about what you're thinking in terms of the mapping. So I'm hearing a desire to move the maps forward, which makes sense, but we don't have a process yet for how we're supposed to propose changes to them, nor do we have a map altogether. And I also did want to talk about the process of consent. So are we thinking that, because we set up a process whereby we invited the public to make proposals to us, but we haven't closed the loop on what is supposed to happen with those proposals.
So my suggestion at a high level with the maps would be that the kind of thing that you're talking about would be what we would be spending a lot of January doing. That in December, or the second half of December doing.
Right.
In that 2-month period of time after December 9th.
Okay.
So that on December 9th, we would approve on first reading the map, but we would also have the ability to give direction. You need to cut transition zones half the depth. There's just way too much transition zone here. Cut it in half the depth. Or to come up with an overarching policy about we don't want any RM1 on suburban transit corridors. I mean, that kind of higher level kind of direction. Some of the map changes, I guess, that would come from neighborhoods would be susceptible of kind of a general policy statement. And some of them would be more context specific. They would be saying, when you look at our neighborhood, this is a better way to do this lots or this area. I don't see us considering those things for December 9th, but I do see those things airing and getting elevated after December 9th and before we vote on second reading, which as a practical matter will probably be the first week in February, although we haven't set those dates yet just because we're where we are with the clerks and our meetings and the like. But that's I think when we would be looking more at individual district council members coming in and saying, these are the lots that I think should be changed. So we would have a high-level map kind of direction being given for December 9th, and then the more specific direction being given, elevated on message board and presented in December and January.
Questions? Okay. So, I guess we can wait until we get into January on that detail. I'm not really thinking that as a council we want to sit through amendment by amendment of the changes that each of us might want on the map because there were errors or because there was all kinds of things. You know, Councilmember Flanagan's raised a few kinds of things and stuff like that. And I've raised a few things, and many others have. So I'm working back from that. I think that that's a very awkward process for each of us to have to go parcel by parcel, and that's why I was suggesting a consent process.
And I don't have a problem with that. So and I just didn't address that.
Okay.
I mean, I think that as people elevate things, as a council member elevates things in December and January and says, these are the changes that I want to be able to make, everybody can look at them. And I'm fine with having a consent that said all the changes that the council members made, they're all adopted unless they're pulled off.
Okay.
And then anybody could pull off changes that they wanted to have pulled off. I don't have a problem with that at all.
The reason I'm getting into that detail now is I'm just trying to make it clear for staff however we're going to proceed. And if people aren't ready to decide, that's okay. But I think staff need to understand, and we need to be clear on what our path is. So, and that's why I'm suggesting that approach.
I would say in December and January, if people could start posting changes that they wanted to be able to make. And it may very well be that, in January we schedule a work session on mapping where people can just lay out, these are the changes I wanted to make. I mean, I don't know at that point, and I think we have time to figure it out after that. But I don't have a problem with council members coming in with changes they want to make in their area and having everybody have a chance to be able to look at it outside of a meeting and seeing if there's anything that they want to pull or otherwise discuss.
Okay, but they, from a staff perspective, those changes would go into a consent map. Everybody would have the opportunity to know what they are so that they could know what they wanted to pull. But for staff, from staff's perspective, they would put them all together into a map, so we would have the opportunity to pass it on consent.
Mayor.
Greg.
So what I've been operating off of from the mayor's post is that it would be best on first reading to refrain from line-by-line amendments to the text,
right,
or parcel-by-parcel changes, because minor changes would likely impact other sections, and we have all this other work to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we would suggest that we have that be, we focus on first reading higher-level policy direction, so we don't get bogged down on specific code language or specific tracts, waiting until later readings for specific mapping changes. So,
I agree.
And so are we describing something different than that? Because if we have parcel by parcel work, I'm really ready to get into that in February, which would most likely, frankly, mean on most parcel by parcel changes, council members would suggest, I would assume that I'd probably be fine with lots of different little corrections. I would just want, in the course of those weeks coming up to February, to better look at those and say, well, I agree with all 5 of these. I just have a problem with this one. That way we're only debating on second reading the one, instead of somebody having to explain all 6 of them to us.
So I would see what we would pass on first reading will be the map with direction.
Right.
What we will get back from staff is the map adjusted with the direction that we gave on December 7th. Separate from that would be council member changes that council members, everybody on council could elevate whatever changes they wanted to be able to make in December or January that were outside of the direction that as a council we gave on December 9th. Then when we got together in February, then we could pass the mapping changes.
And I just, what I'm saying is I don't think...
That would be part of the second reading approval.
Right. I don't have an interest in any of our work sessions leading up through December or on the December hearings to discuss or hash out parcel by parcel changes, because I think that if people post those online and raise them, our staff can look through them, and probably a lot of them aren't worth discussing, right? The mistakes as labeled by Councilmember Flanagan, or a particular thing that, you know what, this church got up zones to this thing and they didn't realize it was a church and we're going to fix that. A lot of that I just don't know whether any of us have to discuss in a work session, because I imagine a lot of that is going to go consent. So I just don't have an interest in, I personally would be opposed to us spending time discussing parcel by parcel stuff, and instead between here and February, people uploading as much of that about their district as they can, and having our staff handle, our council staff vet most of that for us offline, because a lot of it I think is going to be so minor that we shouldn't be discussing this little thing in the city.
Ann.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was talking about the process in February. The reason I'm getting into specifics now is because we promised the neighborhoods a path to look at their areas, and understanding that our goal is capacity and our various other goals. We promised them a path, and I think that if people are talking about passing a map on first reading, which I need to withhold judgment on that at the moment, because I'm not sure if I agree with that. Without the public understanding what their path is for what they just submitted to us, I think it's going to create a level of angst that's not necessary. So that's why I think it's important to be real clear right now and stay with it. I mean, I don't mean right this minute, but I mean at the point, so that people understand that they submitted some information is being looked at, and what is the path for it to be considered. That's what I'm trying to get at. And I agree with Councilmember Cassar. I have no interest in going through parcel by parcel what's happening in other parts of town. That's not the areas that I know best. And so I think that that's why I was suggesting a consent. But I want our staff to be clear from us, and I want us to be clear with our staff what we're expecting them to do. And to my mind, we're expecting them to present a map that we can deal with on consent that has all those parcels in it. So, I mean, people can think about it. We don't have to decide today. But my goal would be, by the time we come out of December 9th, we're very clear with people about what's going to happen next on the map. So,
Mayor Pro Tem.
I'm still not understanding, Mayor, what you said. You said we could pass the map with direction. Are you talking about in December?
Yes, on December 9th, we would pass the map that the staff presents to us as we go into December 9th. It could be as part of your November 25th, your work. If there are changes that you think need to be made in the map based on the conversations you have, you're going to present to us on December 9th your best map, taking into account what you've heard and the changes you would make. It could be the same map, but you'll give us whatever is the best state of the map at that point. We approve that on first reading with direction. And
That's what I'm confused about.
And the direction wouldn't be individual lots. I want to change this lot from RM1 to R4.
Mm-hmm.
It would be more global map direction if we made one. We
Okay,
think transition zones should be twice the size they are. We think transition zones should be half the size they are. They would be global state directions.
Okay, so for example, there's one theme that keeps going is some transition zones go deeper than others. My understanding that is because most of those are in high opportunity areas where we want people close to grocery stores, et cetera. So if a council member says, my direction is transition zones throughout the city will only go up to 5.
We'll take a vote on December 9th. It'll either pass or it won't
Okay,
pass.
so there will be a vote. Thank you.
Ann.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm clear on how we're doing the mapping, but we can think about it. I'm not comfortable right now. I'll try to get comfortable, but I'm not comfortable passing a map on first reading that we haven't had the opportunity to address the kinds of concerns that all of us have been raising. I mean, some of them are, so for example, I have a few parcels that really I have thought should be Ps because they're parks, but that change hasn't been made. So I'm concerned. I would feel much more comfortable if we just put the map aside. We can pass direction on the map, but not pass the map on first reading because there hasn't been an opportunity to make the changes even on individual things that appear to just be mistakes.
Mayor.
So I think it would be, okay, Jimmy, and then.
So I think it's important for us to, I mean, very few of us are left in the room now, but I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that we are not, and the community, that we are not passing anything in December. We are moving the process forward through first reading. I have seen content coming out of some community groups that claims, the council could adopt the whole thing in December and everybody freak out. We all have a responsibility to make sure the community knows that that's not the case, that we are not going to be adopting anything in its final form in December. We are all universally agreed to that, even though there are people in the community who are saying otherwise. And I think this is just like we do on zoning cases, just like we do on all things. We move stuff forward on first reading with any of the things that we want to see come back at second and third, with no guarantees that we're going to adopt stuff at second and third. That's how everything works. So I think it's important that we move everything forward together through this process, noting at first reading the things that we want to see coming back from staff at second, just like we do on everything else.
To your point on parks, I think that it would be appropriate on December 9th for someone to say, there's a lot of parkland in the city, properties being used for park that aren't zoned as P. They're zoned as whatever the adjacent properties are, and we think after discussion that all of those tracts that are being used as parkland should be zoned P. I think that would be an appropriate kind of global instruction to give to the staff on December 9th. I don't know if that even makes sense, but that would be a discussion about this particular tract should be zoned P. is a conversation that we would have as part of the process. In people would post those in December and January.
Okay, just one last thing. I hear what you're saying, Councilmember Flanagan, and I have been, I think we've all been trying to do that. But all I'm just saying to folks is that I think if we are, I think the public will not trust us if we pass a map on first reading that we haven't had the opportunity to actually suggest or consider changes. I think it's easier to say, not easy is not the right word, I think it's more credible, that's not the right word either. I feel like we can do that with the text, but I don't feel like we can do it with the map because of the level of concerns that people have, and I also don't think it's necessary because I don't think it slows down the process, and I think what's really important is that people have some level of trust in the process. And so that's just my initial reaction in terms of the map part of it and voting on first reading. So,
Greg?
First, I'll say that I would like to figure out what the process is in February for doing the parcel by parcel, and the consent thing makes sense to me on first blush, and maybe laying out that process for people will be something we can communicate. The reason that I would rather move the map forward for now, I'll be open to hearing others continue thinking about it, moving the map forward rather than pulling particular parcels now, and I think this would make sense to people when I explain it, is if there's a motion to double transition areas in a certain area, or if there's a motion to half them in other areas, and that direction then passes and the staff works on it, then we're going to come back. There's going to be a new staff map that comes back to us. And I would want to be doing my parcel by parcel edits the best that I could, informed by those staff changes, if that makes sense. So what I'm telling folks is this preliminary map is certainly going to get changes. Staff is already considering changes. So before I finalize what my parcel by parcel work is, I want to get the bigger, the round 2 of our April and May deliberations done. So that way I know when I'm parcel by parcel editing.
Maybe, Ann, there's a way, and I would work on it with you, to create another document or instrument that is happening contemporaneous with our vote to approve on first reading the map, which would be a list of things that had been identified by any council member as to particular things on the map that they knew that they wanted to be taking a look at or offering changes within their district or otherwise. So maybe there's a vehicle or an instrument or something we could create so that council members would have ability to be able to earmark those things or bookmark or park those things so that that could be shown to people in the community that were in an area that could see that that was still, their council member was still putting those in play or wanting to put those things in play.
Okay, I will think about that. I hear what you're saying, Councilmember Kassar, and I agree with all that. I just don't think passing a map on first reading is necessary to do all the things that you said. So.
All right, anything else? Yes, Leslie? Leslie, and then we have our time.
Just wanted to make sure for December 3 and then December 4, we have our list of additional topics so that our staff can prepare and we can prepare for it. And I'll point again to the capacity, parking, the 2 types of heritage preservation, protest rights, and there might have been one more that was on the list that Ann and I posted, because I know we didn't get to those today, but we weren't expecting to. But
I would urge everybody to go ahead and post those things.
Key them up for the 3rd of December.
And we'll try to organize as best we could. The other thing that I mentioned in the post that I think would be significant is it would be my intent when we get together on the 9th to deal with those amendments first that were published and posted by the 6th, because those would be the universe of things that people had the most chance to really get ready for and think about. Those would be the things that the public had the chance to react to at the public hearing on the 7th. And I say that with the understanding that, of course, this council is free to consider anything that it wants to, and I'm not proposing that we not consider anything that someone wanted to bring up that day. But I will bring up those other ones first. So if you're interested in having something brought up earlier, please make sure you
Are you talking
post.
about on the 3rd, or are you talking about on the 9th?
On the 9th.
Okay, I just wanted to get a confirmation from you, though, that the items that Ann and I had posted will be on the agenda for discussion on the 3rd.
Absolutely, and I was
Okay,
urging
great.
everybody else to go
Thanks.
ahead and do that. And the more those things come in, then I have the best chance to being able to organize the 3rd and the 4th in a way that's constructive. And then as we start meeting on the 9th and actually start considering directions on a part of the first reading, I'm going to start with the things that are posted by the whatever time it was on the 6th as per the post. Okay, we done?
I guess I would caution us creating two maps, because if we're trying to be transparent and clear and not confuse the public, I appreciate any discussion on trying to get us to an easier place, but I think there's already confusion on things that so-and-so posted about renderings and whose is the right model, and then, to have two different maps, well, what is that map and what is that? I would just caution that process.
Okay. All right, that said, it is 1:53. 12:53, thank you. 12:53, and this meeting is adjourned.
When I fell in love with you, I thought the sun would fall from the sky, heaven open wide, my love, in your eyes, I was just alone.